Hello and welcome to the FDA Project DataSphere Symposium on Data Sharing. I'm Bill Louv, President of Project DataSphere. The mission of PDS is to catalyze efforts to leverage data and data science to improve outcomes for cancer patients. This is the 10th in this symposium series that started in 2015. Each symposium has focused on some element of our mission, bringing together experts to share information and views and to identify specific actions. That's the hardest part, is identifying specific actions to move things forward. And I'd like to challenge everyone who's attending today to identify a specific action. And you can put that in form of a comment or a question in the chat. Now it's a pleasure for me to introduce my colleague, Dr. Donna Rivera. Donna is Associate Director for Pharmacoepidemiology, Real-World Data, Real-World Evidence at FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence. She was previously Scientific Project Director in SEER at the National Cancer Institute. Donna, I'd like to welcome you and invite you to give us your perspectives on the importance of this symposium.
Thank you so much, Bill. I am also very excited to welcome all of you to our collaborative FDA PBS Symposium. And as mentioned, this marks the 10th year of our partnership. In the spirit of collaboration, we are focusing on a very salient topic, data sharing. Especially now, data is abundant and integral to drug development. FDA is responsible for advancing public health by helping to speed innovations that can provide safe and effective treatments, as well as assuring the public get the accurate, science-based information they need to optimally use medical products to maintain and improve their health. While data is more plentiful than ever, we know that data is not evidence. We need ways to use this data to provide evidence and helpful scientific information to inform novel uses for existing drugs, as well as optimizing clinical trial design, public health policy, communication with patients, drug shortages, diagnostic testing, drug repurposing, and post-authorization safety and monitoring, and many more. COVID-19 has amplified the need for data sharing alongside evaluation of data quality, application of rigorous methods, and scientific collaboration. Indeed, COVID was a catalyst for the scientific community, forcing adaptability, creativity, and flexibility with an unparalleled level of collaboration and multi-stakeholder research to inform pandemic response. This was true across the evidence generation continuum, from adaptations for traditional RCTs to rapid analysis of real-world data where trials were not yet available. An example of an interactive, diverse, multi-stakeholder community is the Reagan-Udall Evidence Accelerator, focused on answering key questions on the natural history and treatment utilization, as well as more recently, methods and vaccine safety to address the pandemic. In the UK, the Recovery Trial is an example of a pragmatic, adaptive trial design where an intense collaboration of 186 active sites is continuously learning more about potential treatments for COVID-19. Can we take these examples and the lessons learned to understand what is feasible, and how can we sustain the progress made during this global pandemic? From a regulatory perspective, the use of the highest quality data to provide clinical evidence in evaluation of benefit risk is needed. We cannot generate evidence without data, and data sharing is a crucial opportunity to widen that evidence base. Specifically, data sharing may benefit populations that are not easily studied in traditional randomized trials, such as in rare cancers, pediatrics, or biomarker subpopulations. Increased volumes of data may also be able to generate better insights across populations within a disease. For example, within racial and ethnic subgroups or older patients, critical information to advance our collective goal of health equity. The use of master protocol designs or common control arms speak to the opportunity for collaboration and sharing to enhance patient-focused drug development. Data sharing can also boost evidence generation through leveraging pooled clinical trial data for examining drug safety and adverse event rates, disease modeling, biomarker development, drug repurposing, and discovery of novel clinically meaningful endpoints. The FDA gains knowledge from the use of pooled data analysis in drug development and review welcoming additional evidentiary insights from expanded access to powerful data resources. Data sharing requires a collaborative, community-focused, on specific, a priori purpose, fit-for-purpose data and research questions that support transparency, reproducibility, and validity through methods, harmonization, and analysis. Examples of data resources that build on these principles at the FDA include federated models like the FDA Sentinel Initiative, which has transformed drug safety monitoring for medical products, as well as public-private partnerships, such as this partnership with PDS and the partnership with the Critical Path Institute, which is building a data repository through the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory. These are just a few examples of the many public-private partnerships that promote the development of new tools, methods, and approaches to foster innovation and bring efficiency to FDA-regulated product development. Across the Department of Health and Human Services, there are several examples of data sharing. The NIH has developed a data sharing policy for grantees, established the Genomic Data Commons, and more recently, the introduction of the STAR Act has prompted the development of resources to advance understanding of pediatric cancers through the Childhood Cancer Data Initiative. More specifically, a National Childhood Cancer Registry and a federated pediatric cancer data ecosystem are foci of this effort, and we'll hear a bit more about that a little bit later. The Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT is integral to the conversation around data resources and sharing, and has several initiatives around interoperability and governance while ensuring patient protection. Additionally, the 21st Century Cures Act has inspired the creation of a common set of data standards, which is in progress. The department is focused on data sharing with an emphasis on the principles of transparency, sharing, privacy, and security. Another example that has emerged from COVID-19 is HHS Protect, a data platform and hub that aggregates disparate data sources for use in informing healthcare system planning. Based on this cadre of examples, the why for data sharing seems evident. It is about answering the question of how. And today, I hope our discussions think boldly about the common challenges of data sharing and focus on modern solutions. Data sharing is hard, from designing, linking, and pooling data to the complex analytics required to analyze such data. A wealth of expertise, forethought, and resources is necessary to build useful sources of evidence. Surmounting the scientific hurdles to more effective drug development and review requires collaboration, willingness, extensive high-quality data input, and significant resources for harmonization and interoperability, where the barriers faced often include concerns around ethics and patient privacy, protection and consent, intellectual property and commercial competitive interests, financial investments, and academic credit, among others. We encourage various stakeholders to consider the benefits of sharing data to support drug safety and evaluation for the benefit of patients, including be able to share data with patients and providers more quickly and facilitate more facile drug development to bring much needed therapies to patients. Evidence generation, whether from the use of real-world data or randomized controlled trials, or even both using innovative trial designs, should be conducted with the highest scientific integrity and patient-centered. With that common goal, evaluating the needs for data sharing and ways to solve the current problems while mitigating risk is the purpose of this conversation. How can this community increase our knowledge to answer key regulatory science questions that serve our mission in protecting patients and promoting public health? Particularly relevant themes in putting together this symposium that we hope emerge are the patient voice in data sharing, sustainability practices in sharing and reuse, and keeping the focus not on the problems, but on finding sustained solutions to accelerate progress together. Thank you to the excellent panelists who agreed to join us today, representing a diversity of perspectives from patients and clinicians to data scientists and researchers, as well as industry, foundations, and fellow government colleagues who are very active in the data sharing conversation. And thank you to the planning committee, including the staff at Project DataSphere, our NCI colleagues, and my FDA colleague, Sandeep Agrawal, for their dedication in setting this symposium up for success. With that, I'm so pleased to begin what is hopefully going to be an exciting and enlightening symposium. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Bill.
Okay. Thanks, Donna. That was great. I'd like to just mention a couple of things about Project Datasphere and comment on why I think we're here today. PDS is a nonprofit cancer research company. We were launched in 2014 by the CEO Roundtable on Cancer. In partnership with SAS, we operate a data sharing platform, and that platform has grown over 7 years to where it is today with over 200 data sets representing 240,000 patients. And there are now 115 publications based on that data. Something that's happened, really just launched in the last week, is a new entity called Clinical Research Data Sharing Alliance. And this is a federation of the many data sharing entities, and we're one of the founding members of that. I think it's a step forward, and it gives us some infrastructure or some structured way to work on standards and interoperability and ways to influence policy and also mutually support one another. Now, among that group, as much as we are colleagues and supporters, Project Datasphere is a bit contrarian in at least two ways. Number one is rapid access to patient level data. So almost all users get access in 72 hours to the patient level data. The other way we are contrarian is that the users can choose to do their analysis on the platform using SAS Analytics for free, or they can download the data into their own environment. We think both of those support data sharing in unique ways and in many important use cases. We also have a portfolio of research programs. The one that I'll mention is on external controls. That's an especially important use case for data sharing. There are many cancer types where the standard of care is evolving quickly, and access to the data is slower than the rate at which the standard of care is changing. So we need quality standard of care data much faster than we're able to achieve now. So what brings us together today? And there's a very large number of people already online. I think it's a shared mission to optimize the value of the data that we're collecting from patients. And there's been progress, especially in terms of transparency. So compared to 6 or 8 years ago, you can now discover much better than you could before what data has been generated. And there's metadata available for you to choose which of those databases might be relevant to your research. But we've got a lot of work to do when it comes to sharing data and reusing data. Only a tiny fraction of that discoverable data is shared and reused. So we do have a great panel of speakers today. They'll deepen our understanding about the barriers to data sharing, and they'll also share with us some barrier busting examples of data sharing. Well, Donna, thank you again. We have a great partnership. My next task here is to introduce our keynote speaker. It's both an honor and a challenge to introduce Dr. Robert Califf. I say it's a challenge because he has done and is doing so much that if I go through the whole resume, the time will run out. So I just picked off a few things that are incredibly impressive. First of all, he's currently head of clinical policy and strategy for Verily and Google Health. He was previously vice chancellor for health data at Science and a named professor of cardiology at Duke. And he is a former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. So given the breadth of his experience and his understanding of this space, there is no one better to kick off the symposium today. So Rob, over to you.
Thanks, Bill. I recognize I'm just a local warm-up band for the heavy-duty bands that follow. It's actually the 3 panels that have been put together have people I love to just talk with and also argue with, and I'm sure there'll be some good arguments to be had. as we go through the afternoon. So I look forward to hopefully stimulating some thought about these topics as I go through them. First of all, these were the instructions that I got about the purpose of the day, and I thought it was a fabulous set of instructions. This is about oncology, but I don't think the discussion needs to be onco-specific. I think the same principles hold regardless of the area of medicine or healthcare. And a goal is to bring the patient view into focus. And I'll talk about where I think that's gone astray and suggest some ways that maybe we can improve that focus. And as I say, I'm really looking forward to what the panelists have to say as they go through how they look at these issues. So here's my overview of at least the way I'm thinking about it right now. First of all, we need to celebrate the progress that's been made. Secondly, I have a view that sharing data from traditional clinical trials is a great first step, but it's not where we need to be with regard to really improving health outcomes. We need to go far beyond that. And I think both Donna and Bill made a strong point there in a similar way. If our goal is to treat the right patients with the right treatment at the right time, we need access to a lot of data under conditions that are acceptable to people and in ways that they understand. But beyond just the data, to make sense of the data, I would argue that we've got to go from millions of people with data that they share to millions of people actively participating in research, because dealing with data that's already been created is important, but there is great value or even greater value in planning the research that's going to be done prospectively and involving people in that work. So we got to come up, I believe, with an approach that facilitates data sharing to determine the best treatment so that we can improve outcomes. Simple statement. Or a way to sort of put it into the form of a proposition. If you ask the question, what's the best way to be sure that my clinicians, me and my family, know which approach is best for me? I would argue the best way is to make sure we have access to the data about as many people like me as possible, how they're treated and how they did after treatment. And here I would emphasize, and I think it has been a focus of Project DataSphere, preferably using RCT data whenever possible to ensure the estimates are not biased, but also including continuous updating of observational data. And my question all along is, do people believe this is the right proposition? And if so, what's holding us back from getting there? Because I feel like in my current job at Alphabet, I can say for sure technology is not the limiting factor. It's really the way that we think about and put guardrails around the data. So this is one of my old slides that has been sort of been my mantra. I don't think we've invented really anything new when it comes to figuring out which approaches to intervening on human disease and prevention are best. We have ideas, we test those ideas in clinical trials. The clinical trials that show good results, we take that knowledge and put it into guidelines. We measure how well we uptake what we should be doing, and where we find gaps in knowledge or gaps in performance using measurement and education, we try to make it better. This whole cycle can be speeded up tremendously if we have much broader participation and access to data. And to the extent that we make it difficult to deal with data, the cycle spins more slowly, and the rate of improvement or the rate of undetected deterioration, which is a major issue in our society today, can really become a problem. But first, let me just celebrate the progress. And I say this having been brought in as a consultant to the Pharma CEO Roundtable in about 2008, at a time when the industry by and large, and here I talk about the medical products industry, I was talking with Atul already that I always like to point out that the healthcare delivery industry is many, many times larger than the medical products industry. And it's always seemed odd to me that we refer to one of them as the industry and the other we don't. But having said that, I was brought in by the CEO roundtable because there was a belief that if people had access to the clinical trials that were being done in clinicaltrials.gov, it would destroy the business model of pharma. Well, it turned out my advice was that's not correct. And several of us said the same thing. Things have happened. And lo and behold, now it is the standard to register clinical trials, and it's also the law, but not only to register clinical trials, but also to register the results. Here again, I'll pick on Atul and Harlan and just point out academia is lagging far behind the medical products industry in this regard, although it is getting better. But in terms of history, this is not a long period of time and a lot of progress has been made. And then we have a meeting that Harlan and I think we're both in, IOM 2013, beginning to talk about sharing participant level data, going through all the arguments. And this is from the publication from that meeting in 2013. I would argue that Project DataSphere is one example where so much progress has been made. And so if you look at one of the many publications, over 100, as Bill pointed out, you'll really see the advantages and the learning that could go on when you combine data from different clinical trials, having access to individual participant data. But that's not all. When I say it's an esteemed panel, I really mean it, because the other great example represented on the next panel is Project Yoda, which involves Harlan's work at Yale and primarily J&J, although I know it's meant to be broader and is broadening. But in an overview of these efforts, it's obvious that we are making progress. Yet what I've learned as I prepared for this is that there are still the same obstacles pretty much across the board in how people think about sharing data, and we'll get to that later. And then finally, Atul has really got a magnificent example in the University of California system, and this just from one of many publications. If you told me 20 years ago, we could start out with 5 million people with their health records and look in great detail at the treatments they were getting and their outcomes, I wouldn't have thought it was possible. But now it's not only possible, it's happening every day. And so we have to wonder, why don't we expand this even further? And we need to expand it. I've sort of had a hobby as a cardiologist of pointing out that only about 15%, or really now it's about 9%, of our major clinical practice guideline recommendations in cardiovascular disease are based on high quality evidence. So I looked up oncology in preparation for this meeting, and I found that, well, it's about 6%. And it hasn't improved really much since 2011. What we have are a lot of recommendations based on expert consensus. And it's not to say there's not good data or that the consensus is wrong. I'd much rather have expert consensus than nothing at all. But you have to wonder, with the technology we now have, why we can't implement research systems that get us the answers in a definitive way much more quickly. And all I need to say is hydroxychloroquine, convalescent plasma, and ivermectin to point out that this is a primary issue for our day. How do we get the machine operating faster so we get the evidence that people need so that they get the right treatment? And I would argue this is not just a convenience. Up until maybe 10 years ago, I would have had the attitude that the US was exceptional, that our health outcomes were phenomenal, and that our technology was supreme. And therefore, making things better is a great thing to do, but the urgency was not there. But if we now, we're all well aware that the US has fared poorly in the pandemic relative to other countries. What we talk about a lot less is that beginning in about 2010, we've seen a deterioration in our overall life expectancy compared with the rest of the world, which has been growing every day. Before the pandemic, it was at 3 years lower life expectancy in the US than our comparator countries. And the estimate based on the results of the pandemic so far is that this is almost 5 years now shorter life expectancy if you're in the US compared to other high-income countries. But of course, this is not a uniform effect. And in fact, if you live in San Francisco or Boston or Raleigh-Durham, you pretty much look like high-income European countries in terms of health outcomes and life expectancy. But if you're a minority or you're poorly educated or economically poor, it looks quite different, as demonstrated in this slide. Interestingly published in the British Medical Journal. I'm not sure why it's not in a US journal. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that the one bright area since 2010 has been cancer. So the massive investment that's been made in cancer is paying off. But I would argue that over time, cancer will be part of the rest of the landscape, and we better pay attention to all of it. So I want to point out, I'm not an oncologist. I'm not an expert in cancer. I happen to have hung out with some experts in my previous career, as this old photo from the Roosevelt Room shows. And I do want to commend the FDA and the Center for Excellence in Oncology with the work that's been done, which I think has made a difference. All right, so how do I see it if I step back and look at data sharing? And I think almost every healthcare entity says that it's patient-centered. And the idea is that at the center of everything should be patients and their families, the people they care about. I would also argue that if you talk to patients, they highly value happy and involved clinicians. And it's this dyad that really, I believe, should be at the center of data and data sharing. But if we look at the reality, the system is not organized around this dyad. The system is organized in a very fragmented manner that makes it almost impossible to put the data together in the ways that we could easily do it if we had the human systems in sync with the technological systems. So what if cancer patients and clinicians banded together to optimize the information base for high quality evidence-based care? All these things on the right would happen much faster, and self-correction could be a routine part of the system. And I think Donna and Bill both made that point in a different way. And then all the organizations which should be supporting this dyad, other carers and caregivers, advocacy groups, health systems, research sites, would be focused on sharing information for the benefit of the beneficiaries shown here. And those who make medical products and those who pay for healthcare would likewise be sharing information, because it's the only way to know that we're improving outcomes as we deliver care. What we're missing is a systematic approach to a transparent, shared base of data that gives everyone equal access in a symmetric way to the information that's needed to put the checks and balances in the system. Instead, what we have are a number of entities which are highly incented to not share the data, because with not sharing data comes a lot of power and a lot of control. There's a term for this called sub-optimization used in the business world. And I think our $3.8 trillion health system is the largest sub-optimized enterprise in the history of the world, as far as I know. And so the ways that this should operate are not new and have been envisioned for years. This is from an old HMO slide, just making the point, as a tool has done in the UC system, and we'll hear more about it, I'm sure, during that panel. Every time someone touches a healthcare system, their information could benefit not only them, but also other people like them if it were shared and aggregated in the right way. In the research system, instead of having passive surveillance, it's haphazard and hard to put together. Just look at the arguments right now about the waning of vaccine efficacy. It's challenging to find the right balance between pre and post market, especially in an area like oncology, where people have made the point and laws have been passed so that enable rapid approval with a commitment in the post-market. And we have two systems, one for research and one for clinical practice, that are not directly linked together, leading to a lot of inefficient one-off studies. If you just interrogate clinicaltrials.gov with regard to COVID, I don't really need to say more. I think everyone's aware of the huge number of small trials that will never advance knowledge in the field that are sapping a lot of our energy. What if we went to a national or global system that had this patient centricity, sharing information for the benefit of individuals and populations, so that we could have active surveillance that's constantly ongoing, embed clinical trials into the system, and leverage real world evidence to support the regulatory decisions that are needed so people can get earlier access, but also with assurance that as time goes on, the facts will come out from better done studies. We also need to account for the fact that anything we do will have benefits and risks. And one of the fallouts of our current system is we're often aware of the risk in the post-market period before we're aware of additional or prolonged benefits. And a more active, constant system would give us a better likelihood. And then the other additional thing, which has been very obvious to me in my job at Alphabet, is that if we were sharing information symmetrically, I keep trying to come up with something better than the triple aim, or what I really like is the quadruple aim, because I do think happy, engaged clinicians are critical to the well-being of patients. The focus has been too much just on lowering cost, not enough on the patient experience or the clinician experience. And we still don't have a way of measuring global outcomes in people over time, something that Michael Porter pointed out in his original article, he and his colleagues, about value-based care, that if you can't measure the total outcome, you're very much at risk of this sub-optimization conundrum. So just a quick word about technology, since I do work for a technology company. I think current technology is absolutely not the limiting factor, but it's a nuclear weapon. It can be used for tremendous benefit for all, or it could be used to further balkanize the population. As you might argue, has happened to some extent in oncology because of the financial toxicity and the very different access to expensive therapies that people with insurance and means have compared to others. Well, we no longer have to worry about information being available if we choose to make it so. We've gone from this way of getting information, of going to the library and checking out a book, to this. And I'm still astounded by the ongoing record with regard to COVID downloads on YouTube, now over 500 billion. And so it's not that people wouldn't look at information if they had it, but we have to give them access to information that's useful, so that when they share it, they get something back. And it's not just the health records that are in play here. We also now can go beyond looking at just one part at the time to looking at the environment that the person was in. And I would argue that the COVID tracker that we all look at every day, and I stopped looking at it for about a week, and then the Delta wave hit. So I'm back looking at it every day. But if you look at a map of a county, of a state, of a country, or of the world, you can see the health outcomes in geospatial resolution that's profound. And no reason that shouldn't happen with regard to other health problems that we have, because the solution is surely not just individual data sharing, but it's data sharing about communities and populations. And I think we've learned in the work that we've done trying to marry the technology with volunteers, for example, in the Baseline Project with Stanford and Duke University, that people are actually willing to share a lot of data if they have confidence that their trusted clinicians are in favor of it, and they have confidence that the data will be handled appropriately, and to the extent that they want it, they're assured they'll get a return of something from that information that they donate. So in my dream world, if we had the right rules of the game, and I hope the panel will get to the rules, we would be able to combine all these different types of information to provide the decision support that patients need with those who they trust to help them make healthcare decisions, including clinicians and families and carers. And for populations, we would aggregate the information by disease type or cancer type or geographic location and make better policy decisions. And it's hard to argue we're doing that very well right now, even though we do have more data than we've ever had. And ultimately, the trade-offs would be explicit about populations versus individuals. So finally, just two last slides. What's holding this back? And it's been interesting to me as I've talked to people over the last couple of weeks preparing for this, I hear the same things. No one who's an expert believes that HIPAA makes it impossible, but something about the ability to say it's a HIPAA issue still holds a lot of things back. There is no question that health systems are blocking data sharing because they regard data as an asset. There's no question that companies are blocking data, that is pharma companies and device companies, because they're concerned about the consequences of transparency, giving away trade secrets, making comparative effectiveness possible, in which case the product might be shown to be inferior to another. And still, I think, not unreasonable concerns about improper comparative effectiveness being done or issues of safety being raised by non-experts who don't understand the data. But at the core of all this is whether people trust others with their data and whether people want to share their data. And I think wanting to share is not the case, not the issue for 90% of Americans. I think the polls are clear about that. I think the issue is, can we create an environment and a set of rules that assure them that they can trust that their data will be used for the purposes that they value? So these are my questions for today that I'm sure the panels will answer clearly. Is the argument flawed that sharing of data is beneficial? What policies and strategies can overcome these arguments against sharing? What policies and strategies can best protect against misuse? What can convince health systems that it's in the interest of their patients who should be served by the systems to share data for better understanding of effective and ineffective interventions? And what can turn data sharing into a positive net present value calculation for the medical products industry? So I hope this is where we'll end up. Obviously not at the end of the day, but over the next relatively short period of time. Thanks, and I hope this has been helpful.
Excellent. Welcome, and thanks for having us here. We're going to get started with our first panel. I'm joined here by three incredible participants who have really shown the world how clinical trials data sharing can happen successfully. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order by last name, and I think there's a slide to show who these individuals are one by one. I'm going to start with Dr. Steve Kern, who is the Deputy Director of Quantitative Sciences at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a group focused on quantitative analysis to support program strategies for therapeutic projects that the foundation funds. Prior to this, he was the global head of pharmacology modeling at Novartis. Our second panelist is Dr. Najat Khan, the Chief Data Science Officer and Global Head at Janssen's R&D Strategy and Operations. She has been rocketing up the leadership at J&J in the past 4 years. Prior to that, was in consulting at BCG. Dr. Khan has a PhD in organic chemistry from the University of Pennsylvania. Janssen and J&J, we're going to learn, is one of the best at sharing clinical trials data through portals. And as noted in her interview with Endpoints, Dr. Khan is uniquely bilingual in two key languages, the science of drug development as well as data sciences. And then we have Dr. Harlan Krumholtz, cardiologist and scientist at Yale University and Yale New Haven Hospital. He's the Harold Hines Jr. Professor of Medicine and Director of the Center for Outcomes Research and Evaluation. And important for today's discussion, he is the principal investigator for the Yale University Open Data Access, or YODA project, a portal where clinical trials data is shared. And as of this morning, there are 412 trials shared at his portal. My name is Atul Butte, and I'm the Chief Data Scientist across the 12 hospitals, 6 academic health centers, and 7 million patients making up the University of California health system. I'm a professor and institute director at UCSF, and I'm also technically a pediatrician. And relevant to this panel, I'm also the principal investigator for the NIAID Import, where we share with the public data from a few hundred clinical studies and trials for which NIAID was involved. So let's get right into this now that you know our panelists. And I'm going to tee this up with a minute or two of discussion and get right into questions for the panels here. So there's data sharing, and then there's data sharing. Some people think that publishing a paper in an open access journal is data sharing. Some people think that making more tables available in their supplemental materials is data sharing. But more and more, we know that sharing data means sharing the raw data or the products of our research. The molecular world seems to have already figured this out. Gene expression data, DNA sequence data, proteomics data, immunology data, molecular structural data all have an established home, and many journals require that data to be shared. And many researchers have even figured out how to build successful careers using those measurements. But it seems to be much harder to get to data sharing in the clinical world, and especially the world of clinical trials. To me, it seems to be a world of differences, delays, and discrepancies. For example, and some of these were pointed out by Rob Califf, there seems to be a difference right now between sharing data from academic institutions and industry researchers. There seems to be a difference right now in sharing data from a successful trial compared to a failed trial. You define those however you wish. There seems to be a difference in sharing data from a clinical trial on a pill that costs 50 cents compared to sharing data from a clinical trial for a drug that's going to cost $1 million. And there seems to be a difference in sharing whether you're a vetted investigator asking for the data compared to whether you are a citizen scientist asking for this data. There shouldn't be differences in any of these, but there are actually differences here. And then when clinical trials data is actually stored and shared, these data can be shared with a little or a lot of relevant clinical data. Now, there are a lot of different points of data and parts of data and data sets. There's clinical data, there's claims data, but most of what we're going to be talking about here is clinical trials data and sharing individual level clinical trials data with the public. And if we have time, we can get those other types of data as well. We have so many reasons why people say no to sharing data, right? The clinical trials data seems to have competitive value to people, to institutions. Having competitors access our data seems to be a threat, or threatening at least, and does seem to cost money and take resources to share data, to get it into the right formats, for example. And then of course, the ubiquitously uttered word HIPAA, or acronym HIPAA, seems to slow things down. So we have so many reasons why people say no. How do we get to routes to get to people to say yes? So I'd like to start with our three panelists. How did you get your organizations to yes? How did you get your institutions to agree to sharing data? Or how did you get your institutions to convince others to share data with you? I want to start with Najat, and then we'll get to Harlan and then Steve. So let's turn this over to Najat first. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's always great question. You know, how did we get our institution to say yes? I mean, I think the first point, which Dr. Rob Califf also alluded to in his presentation, at the end of the day, it is about patients, right? And about the value we can drive by having data that's shared, accelerating some of the insights that we can find. And especially as a data scientist, I can tell you without that, there's such limited things that we can do. So it all started by selecting certain pockets where we said, look, we have a lot of really good clinical trial data, let's say multiple myeloma, like areas that we've done a lot of research in. And for the benefit of the patients, this is an area that we could start sharing. So starting a little bit smaller, showing the value, while balancing some of the risks or concerns, Atul, that you mentioned. There's risks around, I mean, one of the things that we worry the most around is just rogue analyses, right? Because that's not done in a responsible way, responsible science. And I think, what Harlan has done with Yoda and Project Datasphere and other, having that sort of governance to ensure that when you do share the data, that the work that's being done in addition to that is done in a responsible way. I think that has been a route, and being thoughtful about that to success for us. And, the other thing I'll also say is the timing of when it's shared, right? There are always considerations around regulatory and patient privacy. You alluded to that. So how do we find a middle ground instead of saying share all data or share no data, to have the right checks and balances in place, and having right, institutions like Yoda and others that actually make it happen. And then you can see good examples of that happening. We benefit from it. Others in the community benefit from it. So again, with everything in life, doing it in a thoughtful way, having very specific proof points, and then there's more openness as an organization to do it.
Great answers. And we're going to get to rogue analysts as we go through the panel here, because they can be reporters, they can be academics, they can be potential threats here. Let's move right to Harlan. How have you been so successful with Yoda? Not just convincing folks to build it, but getting the folks to contribute data.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say that a terrific talk by Rob. Appreciate those questions, and really Yoda's should be crediting J&J, because and Joanne Waldstreicher are really at the top of J&J, who believed in this idea of data science. I will say that original IOM meeting that Rob referenced, Joe Ross and I went to the IOM advocating for that meeting. Actually, we had funding for that meeting that had come through Medtronic, who we'd convinced to share data when they were being assailed for one of their products. And then the IOM was getting pressure to circumscribe that meeting, to focus it more on pre-competitive data sharing and sharing animal studies for controls, and not the kind of data sharing that Rob was discussing. And we had a little break with them, honestly, over it, because a lot of the industry sponsors felt that they wanted to circumscribe what that meeting was going to be about. When we pulled at first, then the reaction was actually to expand again, and it ultimately became that meeting with a broader purpose. And I began talking with Joanne at J&J about, if you guys are true to your credo, will you jump in and lead with this idea of data sharing? And Joanne, to her great credit, and not easy within an organization like J&J, because there's a sort of natural conservatism around, making leadership moves in the area of sharing what that was considered by many in the organization as their own asset, and really was able to populate much of what Yoda has. As Rob said, we're not just about J&J, but really most of the trials we're sharing at this point are J&J trials, and we have got a process in place to ensure that it's done in a responsible way. But let me say, you discount this idea of people publishing or even putting data in their supplement. We also have to recognize that we're in an era of immense publication bias. The studies that we've done of all trials registered in clinicaltrials.gov that are finished, all trials that are done within academic medical centers, all trials that are sponsored by the NIH, it tops out at about 60-65% that are ever published or reported. And lots of medical centers, you've got investigators who finish the experiment on human beings and never even share that result. So we have to realize we got a ways to go even on the most basic things. And then the delay, we launched a preprint server, medRxiv, to try to get information out. Peter Bach, let's talk about oncology, published an article where he said the time from press release, so the sort of SEC required press release, to publication in oncology, the median was a year. So we think about these national meetings where there's simultaneous publications and everything goes fast, but the median was a year. And that meant that for a whole year, there was a press release, but no real information, no artifact of that in a preprint or on clinicaltrials.gov. So we've got some basic sharing, just even of results. I mean, the results are data too, and that's not occurring, not creating artifacts, not moving us fast enough. And then we've got this situation where for most investigators, there isn't the funding or the inclination or the motivation to be able to be as a foundation for the next studies that follow. And meanwhile, you're an investigator and you're looking around the corner and you're seeing that they're large data aggregators, like everyone's data seems to be everywhere. We've got a spigot to Flatiron, for example. All of our data every day in almost real time goes to Roche from Yale. But as an investigator, it's very hard to get a hold of that data. So we send it to Roche every day. By the way, we pay Roche to do that. We pay them for a quality report, and then they get it, and they get to resell it to Pfizer. They did. They sold it to Pfizer, and they're selling it around. Our data with full identifiers, complete and comprehensive. As an investigator, if I go to them to say to Yale, I'd like a complete download of all the oncology data for the last 5 years because I've got a lot of good ideas. They say, you're crazy, stand in line at the IRB. We'll take 6 months to approve it. And then we'll put you in line with our data technicians. That'll take another 8 months to download it to you. And then it'll be old. Meanwhile, in real time, we have a stream going to Flatiron. Meanwhile, Komodo says they've got data records on 320 million Americans. Same with Optum, same with all of these have. So we've got this weird world going on now where on the business side, a lot of the data is just is out there. I don't know where my data is. If I ask Yale, where did you send my data? They actually can't give me an accounting of it. And I don't say that I love my institution. I think my institution is one of the top, most sophisticated IT institutions in the world. But this is the state of the art. The tool, you know this very well. This is the state of the art at the very best places. And so how do we start to be thinking about bringing all of this back under control, reining in what are the general operating procedures that we believe that most respects patients, agency, and autonomy, and pushes forward the lines of research and gets us in a different state here where we can both share results. I'll just say finally, because I know it's taking so much time, but a lot of what we're driving to is around improving the reproducibility of research. There's a lot of work that's being done that suggests that our work, and I would say in a lot of realms, is, there are questions about its reproducibility, which leads to uncertainty about what the underlying relationships are and who should be treated with what. And so we're trying to drive to a state where we can get there. And finally, a tool, you didn't ask about this, but I think sharing code is an important part of this. I fear that a lot of studies that are out there have had mistakes in code, but you can't tell it from the study. And the only way to do it is for have people have it more transparent and share. We're starting to post code now so that we do a study, especially we do a study on a database that people can get. We want the next group to be able to start with our code. And by the way, if we've made a mistake, tell us. We've gone through it, we've done our best. We have a lot of quality control, but this is the only way we're going to be able to continue to make progress.
All right, so great points there, and I'll just highlight a couple here about reporting results. That a lot of results never get reported. You got brought up the business side of this, especially all these new companies. We'll get to those, and then reproducibility as a motivator. I'm going to push on that one, but not yet, because we're going to hear from Steve next. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks. And Harlan, you just teed up the whole plethora of issues around this, which was awesome. Really, really great to hear. And Najat, I appreciate your comments to start this off. I mean, we as a funder, so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we're of course interested in sharing. Now, I was hired into the organization in 2013 under the auspices to model the data. What a surprise to show up in 2013 and say, we don't have the data, it's with all our investigators. And so then people we've funded won't give us the data so that we can make decisions on the next thing to fund. Sound crazy? It is crazy, right? So that's the goal of one of the things we're trying to work with other funders and move this field in the right direction. Because we were risky investors, right? We like to take risks on things in the hope that they'll actually pitch out. And so that's one of the challenges we find. Around the time that the ICMJE did their data sharing initiative, we joined an initiative with a number of funders to say, data's got to be made available and open for publications on research we funded. We put that in as a requirement. 2 years later, Ben Goldacre did a survey and held us to task because we weren't doing a very good job, just like the publishers weren't doing a very good job as well in following through on that. And so, we got to this conundrum of, I'm going to steal the phrase you used, the tool that I loved in your JAMA editorial, of sharper sticks or sweeter carrots. What's going to be the direction, right? And so sharper sticks, okay, we can tell people no more funding until you put your data in place. But in fact, that's probably just going to create a bunch of garbage going into dumps that then nobody uses and people checking boxes. So we went the sweeter carrots approach. And what we started to do was get on the front end of studies and say at the beginning, as we're starting the study, we want you to share the data. We want to work with you and figure out where you're going to put the data now before we collect it. Oh, and we want to simulate your trial before you start it to see what the probability of success is. And gosh, when we do that, guess what? We get a data collection form so that you can use in that data repository. And we also get a statistical analysis plan. So when the study's done and all the data is collected, you just have to push a button and the result comes out. And then after you see the result, you push another button and the rest of the world can see it. I mean, it is literally that simple. And the best study came out of your institution, actually, that we had been involved in, the Mordor study,
which was an assessment of neonatal mortality, infant mortality, pediatric mortality with prophylaxis azithromycin in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the greatest things was that they were able to essentially have that analysis of the data done very quickly and then available for us to be able to see, now moving out into an open repository. So we realize as funders that, we have to fund this so that it's feasible for investigators to do, right? And we don't do it at the beginning. If we do it at the end when everybody's wrapping it up and wanting to go on to the next thing, nobody has interest. So it's really important to get out in the front end of that component. And then that helps, to Harlan's point about reproducibility, because if we do a study and we fund it and we have a result, then NIH's next study ought to be a brick on top of ours, not a brick alongside of ours. And Wellcome's ought to come on top of that. And our partner J&J should be actually a next component that adds to that. So I think that's exactly the efforts we're trying to pull forward. I'll just say quickly that in COVID, what we did was we stood up this workbench called ICOTA, and Frank Rockroll, I see his smile, is one of our board members on this, along with Marty Murphy from the CEO Roundtable. And its purpose is just that. What you leave behind are the results, a pointer to the raw data, and the scripts. So anybody can come in and actually rerun it, recheck it, redo it, build it, learn from it, go forward, right? That's the only way we're going to really make good progress.
Wow, great points. Okay, so a lot of emphasis on the process here too, especially from the funding side, right? To get all this locked up first, because you're absolutely right. At the end of the study, it's, a lot of these seem to be dependent on that lone postdoc. And once that postdoc leaves, nobody knows what these files are. And of course, the names are, version 2, version 3, and of course, nobody knows anything. So absolutely right. Lock it down early and get those details done often. Let's get right into one of the first points. So what about uses and users of these data sets, right? Raw data by itself on a website, no matter how open, doesn't get us anywhere, right? We need to have users of these data sets to actually create that value that we're all anticipating is going to happen here. But we have this threat, and Najat brought up right away about rogue analysts here, right? And rogue analysts sound like some type of criminal element. It doesn't even have to be that. It has been almost exactly 5.5 years since Jeff Drazen had his paper in New England Journal of Medicine indicating research parasites. Okay, so perhaps there's a continuum there. But the reality is we literally do have folks right now looking through MedWatch data, looking and highlighting side effects of COVID vaccines, right? There are people actually trying to do this. We don't even need fancy new ways to share data to see the effect of rogue analysts right now and how they can, what they think they see can be highlighted. So the question I have for these esteemed panelists is, how do we show the world the benefits of sharing raw participant level clinical trials data? How do we show that the benefits outweighs these detracting issues? And I'm also going to argue, shouldn't research results be so robust and resilient to actually compensate for rogue analysts? Let's go backwards. Maybe Steve, start with you.
Yeah, that's a real interesting point. I mean, I think if we have the systems in place so that anybody can rerun those analyses, following on what Harlan had mentioned originally, right? Then we've got a check and balance system against that. So if somebody wants to game the results by pulling out the things that they like, which happens on a regular basis not necessarily in science, but in the broader community at large, then there's a way to check that and to be able to look at that relative to the other amounts of data that are present. I mean, one of the things that I've been using as just my metric when I think about effective therapeutics is just that simple estimate of something like numbers needed to treat, right? When you talk about numbers needed to treat to a lay audience, they start to understand this idea that some people are going to get medicine that probably didn't need it. And the question is, how many do you have to treat before you save one, right? And then the other number with that is number needed to harm. And if those numbers are close to one another, you don't have an effective medicine. If they're way apart, you have an effective medicine. So I think those are conceptual ideas that a lay audience can get their hands around. And it starts to give people a way to interpret some of these results so that they're not swayed.
No, great points here. Harlan, what do you think? I mean, who are the users of Yoda right now? What are they doing? How sure are you in terms of what they're doing?
Well, I can tell you what we do to try to put some guardrails on, but maybe this is important to understand how science works, which is, I really love this quote from one of Francis Collins' books where he describes science as progressive and self-correcting. And the notion is, I think, that even with the same data, we may not all agree. I mean, it may come to different conclusions. You have an esteemed person like John Ioannidis who saw data at the beginning of the pandemic and interpreted it in a single way. I would never call John a rogue investigator. He's one of the most skilled interpreters of data there is. I may not have agreed with him, but I do think that he's got the skills to be a scientist and to make his interpretations. Brian Nosek did a classic experiment, a psychologist from the University of Virginia, where he sent around the same data set to a bunch of very competent data scientists. And the question was, were referees in soccer matches more likely to give red cards to people of color? And he had all the data together and he gave it to them. And I think it was like 39, 40 different groups. And no one came up with the same result. And ranging from people who said there was an extreme bias to finding no significant bias to a bunch of people in the middle. And then he looked at subgroups. How about by the skill level of the group, the number of publications they had, who was involved in doing this, and it didn't predict what the results would be. And so I think this idea is that many people we need to be looking at it in lots of different directions, and we need to be making progress together. But there may not be a single right answer. There's lots of assumptions within any research, and so what we need to do is start pulling out what assumptions lead and what methodological approaches lead to one result versus another. Now, this was in an observational study, an experiment that's conducted, I think has a little tighter bounds about what the result is, but still someone can then apply Bayesian analysis when it was done in a frequentist model as the beginning of the process. I've seen multiple reanalyses of trials that have brought different perspectives. We should embrace that. We should embrace it. Now, I think when we talk about rogue, if someone comes in with an agenda that's seeking to do harm, that's one thing. But if someone's seeking to do science, I think we ought to accept the fact that there can be disparate opinions. And in fact, that might be something good to understand what's driving things in one or the other. Just to get to the IOTA thing, for example, is what we agreed with for J&J trials, that there would be an application, and the application wouldn't be making the judgment about whether we were in favor or not of the question. And J&J said, well, we want to be arm's length. We do not want to be in the decision-making process, but we want you, Yale, to make sure that there's a scientific question here, that the person who's posing it actually can pre-specify what they're doing. Even if they're doing exploratory analyses, declare that. So that way somebody doesn't go in, p-hack, and come out as if that was the original idea from the outset. And I think there are a lot of things we can be doing in science to strengthen our approach around pre-specification. Is this an experiment, a data experiment, even on observational data we're conducting? Are we just doing exploratory? What is it we want to do? And then we said people need to commit to giving the answers, like show what was your result and so forth. So, but I think that making the data available or in part is about saying someone can make a claim and I can go in there, just as Steve said, and check it. And so it's not a mystery of saying black box, just trust me, here's what I found.
Yeah, I mean,
Great answers. John, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think great answers. And what I would say is, like, look, at the end of the day, it's getting into because to your question was, how do we show up as a good example, right, to actually promote data sharing? And I think a lot of it comes in terms of our own internal practices of setting that bar super high. I completely agree with Harlan, like, having different opinions that and actually insinuates a really good dialogue. But, internally, for instance, at J&J, we have one platform now where we have all of our internal data sets, even external, Harlan, like you were saying, some of the external data. Everything is in one place. There's an audit trail for every analysis that's done. There's a protocol. There's a internal committee review. Things are pre-specified in terms of what we're going to, so you can't cherry pick later on whatever cut you wanted. And so you create like the next set of data scientists, that this is how you work. And if you do that, then we can show, and we have been showing really good examples of where data sharing, we've actually have data sets from others and we've done high quality work. And I just think that having institutions like YOTA and the checks and balances is really, really important. But if we don't have our own folks starting with the really, really high bar, then we can't expect others to do so. And then the other point is there's always going to be other analysis that's done. Like, I live in a world of what's my fixed control and not. And if we have a very high bar in terms of what we're doing, then I think it's probably the only way to counteract some of the other things that happen. But I think it just starts in your own house, and then how do you set the right guidelines so that it's done well across the board.
Okay, great answers here. And I think it should be reassuring to folks. There is a way through all these threats and rogue analysis. I want to switch gears here. We're going to run out of time pretty soon, I think, in the next 10 minutes or so. So we're going to get into more rapid fire mode here. Let's talk about the business world of this, because Rob brought it up, called out Harlan and my institutions for making money. Of course, health systems make money, providers make money, so do pharmaceutical companies. There is a business side to the practices of medicine, certainly in the United States. Now, we have this new world of real world data industrial partners. And just to highlight a couple, of course, Flatiron has been mentioned several times, acquired by Roche. Verana raised $100 million last year. Anumana raised $25 million Series A a couple weeks ago out of Mayo. Inference, I think, raised $20 million out of Mayo. Truveta, $95 million Series A. Edion, $110 million Series C. Datavant and Ciox, $7 billion merging. Trinetics, $40 million Series D. Explorers acquired by IBM in 2015. And on and on and on. These are hundreds of millions to billions now. Question for the panel. Does having more and more of these companies actually showing a dollar amount on the value of this data help or hurt our data sharing efforts? All of a sudden, why share? Because there seems to be money here. I'm not sure where this field is going to go with these companies. Of course, those with money can pay these companies to get the data. The rest of us are stuck, just like Harlan said. Roche has easier access to his clinical data than he does. Harlan, let's start with you.
Well, I think it's just showing, the dynamics of the current environment and where the incentives are. I mean, this money is being spent because there's an ROI on it, right? But people have an expectation that the value is going to be drawn, and the value is not just in this case, most of these companies, ATN aside, but most of the ones you said are purveyors and data aggregators who are then making it available to others who think that they can gain value on it. And it moves data away from being a public good to one that's firmly within the private enterprise sector. And I think there's something broken about companies that can say we have 320 million records. So I wonder how many companies have my records, for example. Like, I have no idea, and sort of hide behind the business associate agreements, which then let data leak from all the health systems, and then have it in a secondary market under a rubric of de-identification. But we all know that all this stuff can be re-identified really easily if anyone has the will to do it. And so I think it's about trying to envision a future that both provide for the groups that are going to add value to data. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I have this level of discomfort about the data being aggregated, organized, sold for massive sums. But and I would say my own institution, as far as I know, isn't making a dime off of any of the transactions, but their data is leaking through the business associate agreements every day. And this thing with Flatiron is a legal arrangement whereby Yale has bought a service from Flatiron. In exchange, Flatiron says, we need all of your oncology data to provide this service, a quality report. And then Flatiron's free through the business associate agreement, now Roche, to be able to then resell, do whatever they want with that data. And yet the scientists, like at least scientists even within our own institution, don't have access to it. So, I think that this is that all this money's going around, all these companies are being founded and so forth, that, should give us pause to think about what's the ideal ecosystem. Again, like Inference, I believe, is trying to add value, right? So there's we get the data, we think we can do something on top, but some of the companies are just simply purveyors of the data. And I think that can add additional friction to the process because they need to get paid a certain amount because they've aggregated through these backdoor practices. And we need to deal with that, I think.
It's such a
Najat, please. I think maybe you know some of these companies.
Very well, but I mean, here's the thing: it's a challenging question. But where my head goes to is, okay, like Harlan, what you said, Inference using the metadata, trying to create value for patients, right? predicting who's at risk, whatever the questions might be, right? Like better patient stratification for IBD. I mean, there's so many questions we haven't answered forever. That's how my head goes. Okay, in order to answer those questions, what as a data scientist do I need to do to get there? Unfortunately, a lot of the real world data, if you go institution to institution, when you get down to the exact number of patients that you want, you apply your inclusion, exclusion, the N becomes small. And then in order to add that value, analyses are just hard to do. I won't believe them, right? If they're statistically not rigorous. And, let's not even talk about machine learning because that doesn't even come to the foreground. And so to do that, we do need a more integrated, ideal state one health system where you can actually, the checks and balances so that the analysis you're doing is for patient value. But the challenge is if we don't have these companies, it's really hard to even do these analyses to add value. I mean, Atul, you're rare in a way that, the UC Berkeley and just UCSF system has connected all of the different data sets. So you have a good denominator to begin with. So that's what I struggle with, quite frankly, because I agree with Harlan. I don't know where my data sets are. I mean, they're de-identified. That's true. But at the same time, if we don't have something like that, then, the UK system is so different, right? Think about the rapid analysis you can do, but that's because the foundational nature of how the data sets are and the infrastructure is created. We just don't have that here. So I think it's a challenging question, but my head goes to responsibly answering questions that add value to patients. And if this helps to get that as an enabler, it is what it is.
That's
and
great.
I would
Steve,
argue
please.
that they help in the sense that they're creating new ways that we can combine the data. So they keep getting better at technology solutions. They reinforce this idea it's not a technology problem we have here. We're really struggling with a problem around governance and will in a lot of ways. But I'll go back that, we don't even necessarily need that. I mean, you'll hear the last session today is a really interesting group of patients that self-organize to share data, not with anybody's help, but just themselves, right? So, and last week in Science, there was this great paper that was published on speed of metabolism over the duration of your life by a whole bunch of investigators self-organizing to combine all of their label studies from metabolic impact studies to basically say, here's what the picture tells us together. So we know what the value can be. We know the technology is there. I think if we can actually get that data organized in a useful way, then let the market churn on who's better at finding those insights and selling their knowledge and their cleverness, not their access and their barriers to data.
Yeah, that's a great
I will
answer.
just say one other thing about
Go
one
ahead.
thing about the transparency is if we're going to be using data from the aggregators, I don't think we can just say this was the Komodo database. Like, whose data was it and how was it mapped? As Atul knows, and Jay, all of you know, that the mapping, the pre-processing, that's the other areas where things get introduced. And instead, we're basically told this is the Optum database. And it's like, okay. Surgisphere went down because somebody called the hospital and said, did you give data to Surgisphere? And the hospital said, never heard of them before. But, if you call Yale and say, did you give data to Optum or to Komodo? They'll say, never heard of them. Or not that I know of, but they haven't. So it's like, we need to be able to have a layer of transparency about these large data sets that we're using so we know where they come from, what kind of pre-processing. That can't be proprietary because otherwise, we're just accepting on faith. We don't even know where it's from.
Atul, can I just build on something that Stephen mentioned, which is really important in terms of the model where patients are sharing their own data, but ensuring there's an infrastructure that enables you to do that. I mean, there are companies like Allstripes, for instance, looking at rare disease patients and actually taking a completely different way of doing it, directly coming from patients. Actually, it's a great way to engage a community that has huge unmet need, but they benefit. And I think Rob Califf also said that in his presentation, which is how are we thinking about how do these data sets benefit, or any analysis we do benefit the patient from the perspective of the patient, not the perspective of the pharma company or an academic. I mean, that's also another angle that we need to look at. So I do like companies like that are coming up as really directly from patients. And there it's really important to have an easy to use infrastructure. So there are companies, a new wave of companies that are also doing that. So just wanted to point that out. And I think.
No, it's a great point. In fact, that's one of the questions that came up from the audience. I'm going to start to draw some of those in here. Tokenization, blockchain. Is that going to make a difference here? We got Luna DNA. We've got a couple of these companies out trying to empower people to even try to monetize their own data. Is it long-term coming or is it short-term? What do you think?
I mean, on the tokenization point, I'll just touch on that one and not the full list. But on tokenization, so let's take all of our clinical trial studies that we do, right? I think we all agree that data sharing has huge benefits. But when I think about long-term outcomes, right now we start going into real world data, but it's not really like for like patients. There's always can be biases. How about if we could just tokenize those patients, opt in, right? It's completely optional, so it's not something that's mandated, and then actually follow the patients and look at the long-term outcomes. We actually did that for a COVID-19 vaccine program. It's the first example ever in history to actually tokenize, and we did it for US patients because, again, all of the right privacy has to be in there. It's in the informed consent, etc. And we were over 7,000 patients that opted in. And I remember, why is that important? Because instead of going to data aggregators and saying, what do I think is happening? You can augment that data by following your own patients and determining the long-term outcome. I do think that it's something that the industry is going to move to going forward, just being done in the right way. But I see there's huge potential in that because at the end of the day, again, benefits patients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love, in fact, a lot of comments already in the chat about your model that it's got to benefit the patient in the end, right? It's not about the making of money, even on the commercial concept there too. But this model of data sharing, self-data sharing, has been around, and we're empowering patients to do more and more because we give more and more of that data. One can argue maybe we charge for it, maybe it's better or worse coming through digital apps, FHIR formats, things like that. I think that's certainly a new world that's going to be growing. We have 4 minutes left, and I'm going to ask a rapid fire question about motivators again. And this came up from several of the folks asking questions. We have many potential motivators and motivations here, right? And some have already come up. We have, for example, journals and their requirements as motivators. We have the Gates Foundation, NIH, and funders as a motivator. We have new reproducibility rules as a motivator. We have patients wanting help for their own condition, rare or otherwise, as a motivator, maybe even patients wanting to monetize their data as a motivator. And then, of course, we have FDA and federal law as a motivator. If you had to pick one of these as the one to invest in the next 3 to 5 years, the motivator that you think is going to work the most, which one do you think it will be? And Najat, you're on my screen. Why don't you go answer first? And we'll go through the other two and we'll close it out.
Can I pick a motivator that you didn't list out?
Yes, definitely.
There are many. I just don't know. No, look, I mean, at the end of the day, the motivator, just so I understand the question, to really drive patient sharing, to me, it's all about value and showing the value creation. Look, I think you're going to get a certain sliver if it's, regulatory or if it's journal or whatever, but we need to advance science. We need to we have so many questions that we've been asking for the last 20 years. This is one way of answering those questions. So to me, it's about actually addressing medical and scientific questions that it's value for patients, and that can be a huge motivator that I think many of us can get behind. I mean, there were questions in terms of who owns the data, right? Like at the end of the day, the patient can get behind it in many different cycles. So that's what I would pick.
Harlan, you want to go next? And then followed up by Steve.
Sure. I mean, I think you know that I've been working hard on trying to tip the balance of power in the research ecosystem. So if we're going to talk about studies that we enroll people, I think get rid of the word subjects, start thinking about partners, and these people who are participating recognize that the need for progress is greatest, among people who are facing the health challenges as they get really part of the clinical trial ecosystem and have more power in the process. It's not like what's going to be a motivator. I think we just need to change normative expectations. The enemy's the disease. It's not, and the competition is competition against disease. And the notion endpoint here is to try to put people in a better position to achieve better health and better health outcomes. And I think that it's really hard to be in a room with a bunch of patients who are partners in the project and start talking about how you're sequestering data and how you're not allowing others to, smart minds around the world, to start thinking and participating and building upon that work to move faster. And so, I think what I would like to build and what, as I'm doing with Hugo, as is this notion that people can gain more agency over their data, can be participants in studies as equal partners, and have a say over that idea about what happens with the data in the long run. And I think people can participate more than one study. We can increase the cycle time, or we can decrease the cycle time and increase the number of cycles if we can be participating and holding hands with people who are actually facing the health challenges.
All right,
Yeah.
Steve, bring us home in the last minute.
I think that's a great point, Harlan, in terms of the patient center and thinking about who we're actually trying to help and serve. That's exactly what all the funders are trying to do too. They're trying to advance science, but they're really trying to help patients who are struggling with some of these issues. I love Najat's add-on of value. And the thing I love about it, Najat, is that everybody, if we do this right, everyone gets value. Everyone gets different value, right? But value comes to everyone. Patients get better care, right? Researchers don't waste their time on experiments that don't work. Investors and funders put their money on projects that actually have some degree of success and hope, right? So there's value for everyone in the system if we can just align these pieces up.
Well, this is great. We're at our time. Please, as an audience, give a virtual hand to our panelists today. I think we got to more agreement than I was thinking we would. Maybe I was hoping we'd argue more, but perhaps agreement's not so bad to launch the day. I'm going to turn it over back to our hosts, who will then bring us into our next panel. So thank you all. Thank you, guys.
There we are. Perfect. We have everybody on here. This is great. And so let me just start off. I'm David Chambers. I'm Deputy Director for Implementation Science at the National Cancer Institute. And I was asked to chair this panel, which is really focusing on sustainability of our data sharing practices. And when I was asked, the notion was that implementation science, which is the area that I oversee at the NCI, might be a relevant lens to think a little bit about data sharing of our clinical trials. And so what you see here at the bottom is this, there in larger form, a couple of graphics that just help to give a brief intro to folks who are less familiar with implementation science about what are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. So the left, which comes from a paper we did back in 2009, tries to draw that contrast between what we're typically looking at in a clinical trial. What is it that we try and provide to a patient to yield all the way on the right at some health outcomes, where implementation science is trying to move from the what to think about how. How do we make sure that our discoveries, that our data are taken up so that they can have maximal use? And so some of the implementation outcomes that we think about are the feasibility, in this case, of using the data, the acceptability, sustainability, which of course is going to be key to our discussion here today, the costs associated with it, and the degree of uptake that we want to try and achieve so that our valuable resources, the data, can be as useful as possible. On the right, this particular graphic comes from our National Cancer Institute annual plan from 2021, which again sort of tries to briefly talk about implementation science as a range of different innovations that we're trying to get used. They're sometimes underused, sometimes there may be innovations that are overused, but we're trying to get to optimal use of our discoveries that can be affected at every level of our system. And so importantly, that we don't just think on day one of how can we make our discoveries as useful and available, accessible as possible, but how can we sustain that use over time? So just to set up that our discussion is really concentrating on that sustained use of data sharing, and we have these three wonderful experts who are joining us, who I have the pleasure of being able to ask questions and listen to. So those three panelists are, and you'll see the slides associated with them as we move along. As we're introducing, those are first Dr. Frank Rockhold, Professor of Biostats and Bioinformatics at Duke University Medical Center, who brings together joint perspective around academic and industry experience. Then following our second panelist, you'll see a smiling face as well, Jamie Guidry-Avil from the National Cancer Institute as well, the director of the Office of Data Sharing. And then our third panelist is Yili Pritchett, Vice President, Head of Biometrics at G1 Therapeutics, again, bringing a solid experience, expertise from industry. And so thank you all for joining us. And just to kick things off, wanted to give each of you an opportunity to discuss a bit around the inspiration or the motivation of the organizations that you work with for clinical trials data sharing. So a way in which we can kind of set the context in which your experience around clinical trials data sharing have occurred. So Yili, can we start with you and just give us the initial perspective, your context that we're going to set as part of the larger conversation. And then we'll go next to Frank and then to Jamie.
Thank you, David. Happy to be here. And actually, it's our honor to present our G1 experience at this symposium. So talk about our experience. What we did is reasonably simple. Last year, we sent our first 3 data sets to PDS. So very simple statements, right? But behind that was lots of work. That was first time for our company, including myself, 20-some years in industry, doing such a thing. So how to start this? G1 senior management got contact from PDS, and then we immediately realized the importance of sharing data. There's no argument about this. It's really, we heard today again, is to optimize the value resigned in clinical trial data, right? But for us, as biostatisticians, being a trained PhD statistician in this field, working on many new drug developments, I see this is my contribution, not just doing new drug development, sending new compounds to patients' hand to help them, to treat them, right? But also we can make our data to be used by others, researchers, to dig out more values. And we also doing our clinical trials, we really benefit from those publications. For example, when we need to design clinical trial, worried about confounding factors, worried about prognostic factors for survival outcome, what did we do? We researched papers, right? Research a relevant patient population, find the answer, put it into our design. So we benefit from those researches, those publications. So with that being said, our team signed on this project. No negotiation. We just put on the timeline, right? We last year we were on NDA, G1 teams on NDA, and then so we put out after NDA. We said we picked up whenever NDA packages some to FDA, we pick this up, and then we did. It was not that simple because no one did something called the de-identification, which you from surface you thought is simple. Take out patient ID, you are done. No, it's not that simple, right? The point is you need to worry about some patients' information can be easily identified through the database, although that was the purpose for sharing, but just worry, right? Someone uses data to find the patient information. So that's our responsibility to protect patient privacy. So we read the guidance carefully. That's our first step, read the guidance very carefully, and then come up with a plan called a de-identification plan. We have a plan, just like ASAP. We have a plan. So going through those patient-related variables, we define on this high risk, medium risk, low risk for relieving patient information. So take care for how to deal with them. The mega plan. Once this plan being created, has internal review, and then we apply to studies using SAS programs to deal with those possible issues. And then lastly, we not just send out data, we ask for validation. We ask independent eyes, independent statistician doing validation to make sure that person couldn't find any information could be related to patient. So that's how we did.
Great. Thanks so much for setting the context. Frank, similar question for you, the sort of inspiration, motivation around clinical trials data sharing.
So thank you very much. I've been fortunate to be involved in data sharing initiatives for over 20 years. And so that the perspective is interesting. That hard to come up with new ideas after all the great speakers ahead of me, but I might say some things that are maybe a little bit different. I've been doing this a long time. I was fortunate enough to work for an organization, GlaxoSmithKline, that was committed to data sharing. So in 2004, we put all the results of all 5,000 clinical trials of GSK on the company website before the CT.gov was up and running. We put all the IPD in 2013. I helped start CSDR, did work with PDS, worked with Bibly, run the SOAR system at Duke. As Steve said, part of ICODA and the CR, the Clinical Research Data Alliance that Bill said Duke's a founding member of that, and I sat on the CDIS board for 10 years. So all the relevance of that is there's a bit of Groundhog Day that's going on. I mean, a lot of these issues have come up before. I think, as Rob said, in 2005, the pharma industry was convinced the world was going to come to an end if we had to register clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov, and it was going to destroy the entire commercial alliance. So the motivation under all that, so it is, and it's already been said, that the patients, and if I focus on clinical trials for the moment, patients absolutely want their data shared. That's been shown many, many times. Future patients want the patients from clinical trials data shared for their own purposes. And I think a tool I saw put in the chat, an important comment about people need to stop using the word ownership. It's a shared enterprise. And I think one of the things that also motivates around data sharing, whether you're in academia or in the pharmaceutical industry, is what's actually important to share is your failures. And I think Steve Kern or somebody actually alluded to this. If something's not going to work, or a target's not going to work, or a method's not going to work, everybody needs to know that, so we don't waste money and resources reinvesting in the same problem. I think the idea of disclosure, there's a lot of technical terms about whether or not access or sharing is important, or transparency versus disclosure. But I think one thing is important is around data stewardship. I think it was might have been the last in-person meeting I went to in December of 2019. IOM, Jeff Drazen, hosted a meeting, and he closed the meeting, I think, with something I haven't forgotten. He said, you know what, data sharing is important, and it's really for all the reasons that have been discussed today. But he said, actually, if nothing ever comes out of data sharing, if we actually have better data stewardship and take better care of our data, the world will be a better place. That's how he closed the meeting. Just a few other comments to follow up on yesterday. Actually, there was an editorial in Nature Medicine. I don't know if you saw it, about over the ivermectin controversy that Rob alluded to, and had all the individual patient data been in the public domain immediately after the trials, a lot of the controversy that exists today might have been diminished. And I want to comment a couple of things that came up in the last session. I think the rogue analysis thing is overblown, in my opinion. I mean, I've been watching this space for a long time, and people have published a paper on this. People have done really dumb analyses looking only at overall results or combining publications. They don't need individual patient data to do something stupid. So, and I think we've also shown in the last year, plenty of people have done improper and rogue analyses when they're the primary researcher. They don't need to be the secondary researcher. So I really think that using that as a reason to worry about sharing data, I think is overemphasized. There also it was discussed earlier, the pull versus the push. One of the problems we have is that a lot of the people who want data don't overlap with the people who are providing data. So there isn't a lot of shared knowledge and shared interest, and that does affect uptake. I think Steve referred to ICODA, where they chose to go after results first instead of individual patient data for that reason, because it was easier to get information into the public domain. The other comment I want to make is that, and it relates to something, combination of what Harlan and Bill Loeb said at the beginning, the different platforms have different filters for how you can access data, and this does affect the sustainability piece. I chair an IRP that's supposed to determine the scientific validity of the proposals, and I've really grown to the belief that I don't know that any one group or platform can decide what is or isn't good science. And I think the idea that with PDS has a much coarser filter around whether or not you can get access to the data. And I think that, and the combination of downloading, my personal opinion, but what I've seen over the last 15 years, will actually lead to more uptake. And the more uptake you have, the more pull you'll get. And then I think sustainability will help. No doubt, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, funding is an issue, right? So yes, there are policies that say you should share data. I think PCORI gives you money to do it. Gates Foundation gives you money to do it. Not sure every other funding agency has actually stepped up to the plate there. So I think that is certainly a limiting factor. But I'll stop there and we can continue in the discussion.
Yeah, thanks for the introductory comments and as well as reflecting on prior discussions here today. So Jamie, same question for you, the inspiration, motivation of your organization around clinical trial data sharing.
Yes, thank you, David. And thank you to the previous panelists. There's been really good discussion today and a lot to think about. So representing the government alongside David here, we are public servants. And so the motivation for our organization really is the benefit of the public. And the federal government has really in recent years been increasingly moving towards supporting and enhancing data sharing efforts that would benefit the greater public good, particularly when efforts are being funded with government dollars. And in large part, at least from policy perspective, a lot of that push was started back during the Obama administration with a memo that John Holdren had put out from the Office of Science and Technology Policy that really was pushing that need to have government funded efforts really making their data available, at least digitally, and really helping to advance the greater public good. And so since that time, NIH has developed quite a number of policies that really are pushing that envelope and trying to move toward more what you'll hear these terms often, free, broad, and easy access and availability to the wider research community. And that includes policies like our genomic data sharing policy within NCI, that includes our Cancer Moonshot policy more recently. And of course, very relevant to this group is NIH's policy on dissemination of NIH-funded clinical trial information, which really is set to establish expectations that any of our NIH-funded awardees and investigators that would be conducting clinical trials, whether they're funded in whole or in part by the NIH, really do need, as was mentioned, to register and submit at least summary result information to clinicaltrials.gov for public posting. And to that end, and to the sustainability we'll talk about today, I think along with that effort, NIH has at least really tried to launch a series of initiatives and resources that can enhance its stewardship over that clinical trials data, and trying to specifically focus on the accountability and transparency of the clinical research that we're funding. And looking at the clinical trial life cycle and what that means, I think that data sharing, what we have to cover when we talk about sustainability is not only the sharing itself, but what leads to the sharing? How can we help all throughout the process, as was mentioned, not only the funding for it, but having tools and templates and expectations to set up how we outline the clinical trials, what's expected to be captured throughout them, what's going to be the most useful to share, and then providing ways to share that data. So not just saying, as was mentioned, that we have to do it, but actually sort of putting our money where our mouth is and presenting ways to share that data. And to that end, we're always continuing to add to what we'll call our research data ecosystem at NCI, and NIH more broadly has many data repositories. One such from the NCI does include the NCTN, National Clinical Trials Network Archive, that shares at least phase 3 studies. But as I think was heard earlier in some comments, we certainly know that there are more data that exists, and we need to be working toward getting other types of data in that are associated with these trials and possibly earlier trials. And we also have additional data repositories, and I think this sort of speaks to what Rob was mentioning earlier, collecting multiple types of data and really bringing that in, not only for individual decision making, but for relating back out to the population, and certainly doing that over time. And so we also have our Cancer Research Data Commons that to date holds genomics, imaging, and proteomics data that has been generated on biospecimens that were hailing from NCI-supported clinical trials that include our MATCH trials and others like pediatrics. And they include tools to visualize that data, integrate that data, because I think what's also been mentioned is that we need to be able to use the data. Just making it available isn't enough. The data utility is really important to focus on. And that's something certainly at NCI that I think we've been really focused on in the last few years through certain large scale data sharing initiatives, really enriching those reference data sets to make that data more useful, more impactful for ultimately the patients, but also the researchers and investigators that are trying to come up with those answers along the way. I mentioned the Cancer Moonshot. Many of those projects are really aimed at enhancing that type of large scale sharing. Our Childhood Cancer Data Initiative is building upon that idea, but largely again focused on the need to develop and maintain repositories and tools that can be integrated, that can work together to analyze those data sets in addition to simply making them available so they're useful. And that's just a quick example. My first foray into this type of data sharing really began when I came to NCI. I was leading NCI's Target Initiative. It stands for Therapeutically Applicable Research to Generate Effective Treatments. And it really was a pediatric version of the Cancer Genome Atlas. And really, that was characterizing tumors, matched germline samples with various types of DNA or RNA sequencing in sort of a cooperative structure. And although that effort was omics based and for research, all of the samples, at least for Target, were characterized from bank tissues obtained from participants that were enrolled on clinical and biology trials run out of the Children's Oncology Group. And being able to use those samples for research and then also obtain their clinical data and data from trials that they had been participated in. We had all of that data and outcomes data, and that has just led to revolutionary discoveries, to novel therapeutic approaches that have been employed in subsequent COG trials for patients, multiple publications, all of which actually happened in a relatively short amount of time in the grand scheme of things. And that experience has really helped to shape my view of what's possible to do with greater access to really high quality patient level data to really move that research and innovation further, not just that old ideal of replicating what has already been done, although that's important. So for me, data sharing, in addition to being told we have to do it from the public's perspective, it's really become a passionate ideal within our work within the Office of Data Sharing to help create that baseline of information for as many individuals as we can collectively to really be able to help patients find more treatments and cures that would work for them individually, which is that caveat of working toward precision medicine.
Great. Thanks. Thanks to each of you for those introductory comments. Thanks also to folks in the chat who are already putting in questions that we'll try and swiftly get to. We're not too far away from the rapid response round. But one of the questions that often pops up is, to what end are we thinking about data sharing? And I would love to have quick thoughts from Frank and then Jamie and then Yili. How you define success. So what is the success of data sharing efforts, particularly over time, that you can share with us? Frank?
That's a great question. There's always the so what, why are we doing this, and where's the proof of value? And I guess I've just learned to believe if you do what you think is the best for the patient, and they continue to request that and pull for it, to me, and you get that message to them, that's successful. But I do view it as a journey, and there's not an end to this. So it's we need to make progress. I think as was pointed out earlier, we continue to make progress. We've made progress, a lot of progress in trials, as Rob pointed out. We need to make progress with larger amounts of information. So I think success is forward movement. I think success is also, as Jeff Drazen put it, as I alluded to, is we just need to take better care of our data. And I think that if this helps us do that better and treat it truly as an asset that's going to be publicly available, but it's still an asset.
Great. Thanks. Jamie?
Yeah, I completely agree. And again, being able to see the impact on the patient, I know we've heard that multiple times today, but I think that really is sort of the ultimate goal. And while we're in healthcare or research is really to benefit that population. And so making sure that there is an impact and is a value. And on the flip side, I come from the research side. So also being able to benefit the science and the learning portion of this. So yes, we do need to make an impact on the patients, but we do also need to increase our knowledge base. And so being able to see things like the increased publications or novel therapeutics, or that impact being felt by each individual stakeholder, I think can't be underestimated. I think if we're going to take the time to do data sharing and do it right, that it should have a ripple effect and multiple benefits. And so hopefully it really helps to bring together the whole enterprise.
Great, thanks. Yili.
I think if we know we share the data, researchers dig up lots of information, put in publication, which will in turn support future clinical trial design, help patient treatment options. I think to me that's a great reward. To me, that's the definition we would work toward.
Great. Thank you for that. So one of the things that's already come up as we think about sustainment are the costs associated with it. So just from each of your perspectives, why don't we start with Jamie and then Yili and then Frank? What resources, as you see it, are needed in order to sustain data sharing?
That's a great question. And one is a funder that we get very often, but truly, I think that data sharing done correctly is a very resource heavy endeavor. And that's not just from the financial cost, but really from the time and the expertise really needed to put into the data sets, to formatting, to abiding by certain standards, is costly from all fronts. And so we really have to think about how we're setting up our repositories that are going to store and maintain the data, how we are going to establish appropriate interfaces to access and integrate the data, understand it, tools to analyze and interpret it in meaningful ways. So being able to put forth the resources for the investigator and or an institution to be able to format and come up with that data before submission, but as well as on the flip side, the data sharing costs that are required for setting up repositories, and even the tools that NIH has put in place just to walk applicants through a consistent process for submitting to funding for clinical trials is very costly. But I really would state that I think the investment is the juice is worth the squeeze. So if we invest in the proper infrastructure to do that, I really do think that over time, we reap the rewards of doing that, because when we approach this as individual data sets or individual groups, individual repositories for every single instance, instead of sort of coming together and creating an infrastructure that is much more user-friendly and well thought out to begin with, we can save on the back end. But I think there's no doubt that it's certainly a costly endeavor, certainly upfront and for maintenance.
Thanks. Yili?
Yeah, I think it takes lots of programming efforts. In G1, we are very fortunate. We have a fabulous statistical program team. So that team actually delivered our data, which was sent to PDS. Lots of work, right, to understand the patient de-identification strategy, build our own plan. For example, you want to merge the patient age into categories. You don't want to share patient individual age. Then how to merge them? What's the best way to merge? It's not by theory from 18 to 25, something like that. You run data frequency, understand our data, right? You check clinical trial, collect different data. So we run also frequency, understand the scope of the data, and then decide on how to make them de-identified format. So that's a programming effort. So I want to say, if we change our mindset in industry, we know our job to do any clinical trials, our job is not end by deliver the results, right? Write down CSR, write down NDA package to FDA, get the drug approved. Our job include this part, share data to the public domain to support the community, support the research. Then we can plan our resource upfront to support this effort.
Great, thanks. So we're talking about the expertise as well as the potential financial resources so far. Frank, what do you want to add? Resources needed to sustain data sharing.
Totally agree with both comments that it is a money and an expertise, and you're tapping resources in biostatistics, bioinformatics, data science that are already stretched and rare resources. So it sort of jumps on top of that. But to be can follow up some of the things I said before. I think we can actually help that problem if we learn to perform better data stewardship from day one when we start an experiment. When it comes to the end, it's a lot easier to share, disclose the information if we've got data that's in good shape, as opposed to pulling it out of file drawers and spreadsheets and trying to put it in a set. So I think, to harkening back to what I said before, and there's another. It's a resource, but it's important. You need to have overall commitment from the organization. Otherwise, this tends to be what somebody does as a hobby or on weekends, or it's got to be a main driver or a strategic mission of the organization. That gives people the freedom to do it appropriately.
Great. So I'm also hearing this notion. We think about it in implementation science as well as how do we plan for sustainability? So the things that we're doing on the front end, because we want to see this investment pay off over time as well, at least as I see it. So want to, with these great questions that are coming in from the audience, want to start offering those to our panel. And we'll rely on maybe, because I can see your hands, maybe someone can pop up who wants to join in on this one. So the first question I see is, how can we share valid data that were not collected at the source in an interoperable way? And this is a note about clinical and patient data. So any thoughts about when maybe some of that planning wasn't done up front? Anyone want to take a crack at that one? Great question.
I'm happy to jump in, David. So I think from our current perspective with the research data sharing, that is exactly what we see. And so we have excellent science that has been funded, and data sharing prior really has been a little bit of an afterthought. It's becoming much more purposeful, but I think, as everyone is well aware, we have historical data, legacy data. It takes a lot of time to analyze these data sets. And so the projects were established long before now. So even incorporating lessons learned back can be difficult. Some of that is, unfortunately, back to the resource question, I think just a manual endeavor. There is a lot of times that we have to pay additional money to have people go back, to have data recollected, patients reconsented, things. And when the benefit is great and we have a large sample and we can really get at a specific answer or question, then we are often able to do that. But I think Frank made an excellent point, and being able to start more at the beginning is definitely key. But for sure, I think we're going to be in this space for years to come, of where we have legacy data, and we're going to just have to figure out how to use it as best we can, while at the same time changing our practices moving forward.
Thanks. Frank or Yili, anything else you want to add on this?
Yeah, I can add on. In our experience, we realized we did our job done in 3 months, but still lots of work. But we feel like, because we use data standards, like we very compliant with CDEX, right? With a CDEX in place, cross studies, we have same data structure, same number of data sets, same name of those data sets, and the same name of data variables, right? So once we figure out the strategy of de-identification, we apply that strategy to each study very easy. Size programs we generate for first study, easily apply to second study, third study, so on and so forth. So I'm even thinking for the future data sharing, our life will be much easier with this plan already in place, right? So data standards is very, very key here. If we could do any clinical trial design, either industry or academia, using standards to collect data, that's a big start point, good start point.
Great, thank you for that. I'm seeing another question, and Frank, maybe we'll start with you on this one. How do you address the argument around intellectual property rights as a reason not to share? How would you counter this as that stated reason getting in the way of data sharing?
Great question. Probably discussed that with well over 100 attorneys. I think, again, it is certainly a legitimate question. Most of the arguments, however, that are put forward are theoretical. So, yeah, somebody might be able to use this or might be able to do that. There are actually very few real examples of the problem. So, I think there's certainly some legitimate cases where that makes sense. And by the way, academics make the same argument. All intellectual property is interpreted in different ways. I need this to write a grant or get a fellow promoted or whatever, but it's the same, sort of the same motivation, different currency. And I think it is a great question. And I just think you have to go back and really push the envelope and say, well, give me an example of what that looks like. And frankly, most intellectual property attorneys I've talked to actually don't have any. So I think it's a legitimate, there may be some, and I'm not an attorney, but I think that's often used as an excuse, and I'll use that word deliberately, but I don't know that there's a lot of evidence that's actually ever happened.
Thank you. Jamie or Yili, any thoughts on this one?
I would say when we share data, we are sharing placebo data, right? Meaning in our controlled clinical trials, we share half of it. To me, that's a big protection for our property. That's my personal opinion. So when I get to that level, I feel comfortable to share data. That's the first thing. Second thing, in our shared data, we do have our special data collection. Although those are cancer patient data, but in addition to anti-tumor efficacy outcomes, we collect other kind of efficacy data to address research questions. And then we believe those data are not that relevant to the project of data sharing. So we took them out to protect our company's property. So I think this you have a way to protect company's property, protect IP. That's a fair point. As biometrics team in the company, we are the data steward. We should think that way. We don't want people to get the data can guess these data are from G1 Therapeutics. We do not want people to guess that way. So that's something we have to do sensitivity work. We have to do that. We did.
Thank you. So I'm seeing we have about 10 minutes left. So we're going to try and get to as many of the remaining questions as we can. So one question asks, it's evident that culture and language means a lot for this issue. How do you how do you think that, or where the first step is being committed to data sharing? What do you see, if anyone wants to give us a response, what do you see as the biggest hurdle to getting started? So what stands out? What do you feel like is the biggest hurdle to getting committed to data sharing that you've seen among different organizations? Anything come to mind? Really interesting.
I think resources are really important. We've highlighted a lot of the issues. I think it's organizational commitment, starting at the top. I mean, does your organization really believe this is important? And I think as an example of trying to change the culture at Duke, we recognize that, if you go through the APT committee, your publications and how many publications you have are important. But what we tried to make the point to the dean, who agreed wholeheartedly, that actually sharing data is an important academic exercise. So that's not formally a part of the APT criteria. If you share data and you can document other people are using it, that actually contributes to your ability to get promotion or tenure. I don't know how often it actually gets used, but it's a way of, it showed a commitment of the organization to say, yes, data sharing is important and we're going to support. And I do think, and I was fortunate enough to work for, a company where that was important. That's not true at all companies. So, and I do think it gets also to the difference between, do you believe in full transparency or do you just believe in disclosure? I don't believe only giving the placebo group is full transparency. I believe that meets a need. Martin and Bill have heard this argument from me many times, but I think I think you need to think about if you really want to be transparent, then that's the commitment of the organization. But I do think that's absolutely essential to get that. Otherwise, you got people in companies or at universities sort of fumbling with each other on the ground, and it's frustrating if they don't think they're going to get backing from above.
Thanks for that. Seeing another question that just asks, and first person who wants to jump in, what about regulations regarding the sharing of individual participant data? It mentions EU, for instance, is very vague. It's not as easy to know whether it is allowed or not. So any thoughts about the regulatory environment in terms of individual participant data sharing?
Sure. So I
I'm
think it's
sorry.
been, oh, go ahead, Ely.
Okay, so talking about this de-identification principle, if you do well, you protect patient privacy very well. The point is, you really want to do very well, very thorough. So even whoever want to dig out the patient information, they couldn't. Even they have data in their hand, they play with it. They couldn't identify which patient is this. That's the worry, right? That's the worry.
Jamie, did you want to add anything quickly? Or Frank?
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's important to note that at least certainly on the research side, and as has been mentioned also many times today, is we have to have that information de-identified. And I do think there are quite responsible ways to share individual level data. We've been at this for some time now with the genomics and having that data in hand as sort of something that we cut our teeth on that is potentially identifiable even when you have access to it. We have rules in place, policies in place. You need to have compliance. And so that more of that carrots and sticks that was also talked about earlier. But there's absolutely ways to do that. And first and foremost, if you do de-identify the data, then you actually have also removed some of those otherwise stated regulations that we've talked about here. And so, and that's again, protecting patient privacy, that's come back to that. So if you can de-identify, that's great. GDPR is a whole nother kettle of fish, but what we found, at least in our research programs, is that it's not consistent. And so each sort of individual European state has worked with us in different ways. There are different interpretations, different layers. That's something that I think we're still working our way through. But I guess I would say we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And so I certainly would say in cases where data can't be shared because of certain laws, I hope that wouldn't hinder the thought process around what can be shared that is in line with those laws and regulations up into a certain extent. And then those that do it better or more openly maybe can be used in exemplar if there is a better impact and value.
Well, there is, of course, EMA Policy 70, which is a law requiring release of individual patient data. I sit on the EMA Advisory Board for data sharing. I can tell you, due to Brexit and the pandemic, it's moving at glacial speed. So, but the point about the EMA and GDPR are at odds with each other because they have different views of what is or isn't. So I think that's just something that's going to have to evolve over time. And what's needed is the lawyers that are working on this basically say we need some sort of good housekeeping rules, basically saying, okay, if I do this, then that protects me, because the companies are afraid that the penalty is 4% of your annual turnover. That's a lot of money. So I think there needs to be some sort of rule that sets a precedent when they go to court to say, hey, if I follow these rules, I'm not liable. And that's kind of where they are at the moment.
So realizing we only have a couple minutes left, I want to get to one more question and then give a final opportunity for each person to say anything else they want to highlight here. One question that I see, with the increased availability of shared data, does this increase the risk of data plagiarism? And are there ways in which we can control this risk? Anyone want to jump on that real quick?
I can say it again, in our practice, in our mindset, when we do this, we worry about people use data for wrong purpose. We worry about that, right? So many hackers out there nowadays, right? So that's why we spend extraordinary effort, go to very detailed level, even going through validation to make sure the second eyes come into play. Can you identify this data from G1? The answer should be no. So can you identify any special patients in this study? You can find that country, find that site, locate that patient in the real life. The answer should be no. So the point is, if you do that level of work, it should be safe. Although that effort have to put in to ensure safety. Yes.
I think that's a really hard question and don't have a simple answer. I mean, I think it's hard for, as we know, many examples, hard for reviewers to even spot overt fraud in a data set, to spot whether or not they've actually copied it from somebody. I think that's above, I had to be honest with you, something I had not really thought about. It's a good question.
Yeah, good question. And again, I think it seems like one of the purposes of these symposia are to give us questions to chew on for some time to come. So with the final minute or so, just want to give everybody a chance, and maybe we can go Jamie and then Yuli and then Frank with any final thoughts that you have around sustainability of data sharing efforts, anything else that you said, I wanted to get this in. So here's that final chance. So Jamie, you want to start us with that?
Sure, I'll try to be brief. But I really do want to emphasize my support for what Frank said earlier. I think that if you don't have a commitment to data sharing that starts with the top and is seen through over time, because it can't be a trend in support, because it's a long process. It takes policy changes, it takes compliance, and not everyone's going to be happy about those decisions along the way. I can attest there's a lot of pushback from time to time, but being able to move through that, I think, is going to be really important, and trying to understand that science and medicine is constantly evolving, and that data sharing expectations, the policies, the actual data formatting, the actual repositories, all of those things are actually going to have to be flexible and adaptable. And so if we do want sustainable solutions, not only do we have to have the commitment to doing it, but we have to recognize that this is just a part of the process. This isn't an additional thing or an additional topic. It is science, it is medicine, it is a part of how we are learning and caring for our patients and understanding them. And so building that in, as we said, into each aspect where it's appropriate, I think is going to be critical.
Great, thanks. Yuli?
Yeah, I do agree with commitment part. Absolutely. Like in G1, our leadership committed to patient first value, right? So we do our drug deliver novel treatment for the purpose of patients. For that sake, we also want to support research, medical research, right? Either by academia or by industry. We want to support that. So our data sharing is a physical means to support that notion. And I want to say for us moving forward, it's a mindset change. We know when we do a clinical studies, not just collect data, report the results, we're done there. No, we have continued to deliver the data to be maximized in terms of values, usages. So if we think that way, our mindset changes. So when we do a study, we know that's another task in the end, which is share the data appropriately.
Great, thanks. Frank, final word.
I could just say whatever Jamie said. I think that understand what's best for current and future patients, get commitment from the top, and treat your data commensurate with the value that it cost you to obtain it. So, and if you do that, I think you can help sustain the data sharing, data access.
Great. Well, thanks for that. Thanks to the three of you for such wise comments, and thanks to everybody for the questions. We got to many of them. We apologize for not getting to everyone, but kind of tight timelines. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to help preside over this. So with that, huge applause to our three panelists, and we're going to turn things over to the next really exciting thing, which is a fireside chat, which we love.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our session. I'm Corey Painter, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Count Me In initiative out of the Broad Institute. It's my distinct honor to host this fireside chat with Dr. Ned Sharpless, the 15th Director of the National Cancer Institute since 2017, and Dr. David Fajgenbaum, an Assistant Professor of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, Founding Director of the Center for Cytokine Storm Treatment and Laboratory, Associate Director of Patient Impact for Penn Orphan Disease Center, and last but certainly not least, co-founder and president of the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network. Thank you both for what I'm sure will be an inspiring conversation. In today's chat, we're going to keep with the theme of the day, and we're going to dig into topics tied to data sharing with the goal of surfacing actions that can be taken to better enable policy and practices to drive impact from patient data. The two of you are uniquely suited to offer perspectives that span academia, advocacy, and government. And it's my hope that our conversation will enable all of the attendees to explore what roles they can play to ensure we are moving with a sense of urgency toward more data, better data, and shared data. To start the conversation, I'm going to take a couple minutes and I'm going to talk about the patient partner genomics initiative that I helped build at the Broad Institute called Count Me In. The goal of this initiative is to generate massive publicly available databases of clinical, genomic, molecular, and patient-reported data in cancer to enable researchers to find patterns in that data, to help accelerate discoveries and the development of new treatment strategies, and to build all of this alongside the very patients that it's meant to serve. My role within this initiative is deeply personal. I'm a scientist by training, but I'm also a cancer patient by terrible luck. When I was diagnosed with an exceedingly rare and aggressive cancer called angiosarcoma 11 years ago, I immediately understood the lack of infrastructure that would be required to make even the slightest dent for those of us who were slammed by a rare cancer diagnosis. What I didn't realize or appreciate at that time was that many of the barriers that I was facing could be addressed if you were creative. They could be addressed by building infrastructure for common cancers that impacted much larger populations of patients. And if built correctly, the same infrastructure could be leveraged for those of us on the margins of research. If we could do this and do it well, we have a shot at democratizing the ability for everybody to participate in research and drive discoveries, and to do it with unprecedented speed. One of the silver linings of my cancer diagnosis, if there is such a thing, was that it absolutely stripped me completely of every single career ambition. I know that doesn't sound like a silver lining, but I promise it was. It gave me unwavering focus on one thing, impact, and impact alone. So I came to Count Me In to build this, which enabled me to focus exclusively on just that. In 2015, I joined the Broad to help build the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project alongside dozens of metastatic breast cancer patients. Together, we built a platform that could leverage the will of the patient to contribute to research wherever they lived through remote consent. This enabled us to obtain medical records, biological samples, survey data from patients that were treated at over 1,700 institutions across the country. We have since generated and released clinically annotated genomic data into the public domain. And from the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project alone, we have over 30 peer-reviewed papers citing that data. We took this platform and pointed it to angiosarcoma, just like I had hoped we would be able to do. And within 3 years, we made discoveries that we published in Nature Medicine, and our data was used in several clinical trials that have since validated our findings and created new treatment modalities that have been practice-changing for many sarcoma clinicians. Patients have incredible capacity to help research efforts, and they're clamoring to drive impact. I just want to plant that seed with every single person listening to this. Patient involvement is an area ripe for disruption, and each of us can play a role by thinking creatively in order to maximize their contributions. This can be through their voice driving policy. It can be through tangible measures, such as acquiring and sharing their samples and data. And it can be through participating in efforts like ours to drive the ability to generate massive amounts of data to be shared. I'm sure there are many additional ways that, that this whole area can be championed. And in fact, I'd like my first question to touch on just this, the roles that patients and advocates can play to drive research in their own disease. Dr. Fajgenbaum, you have an incredible story that resonates so deeply. Would you please take a moment and tell us how you drove generation of data in your own rare disease as a patient, scientist, and doctor? And in particular, how do you think that this was made possible? And what were the biggest barriers?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Corey. It's such an honor to be on this panel with you, Dr. Painter, and also you, Dr. Sharpless, and to be a part of what an incredible afternoon. I've been so impressed from the very beginning with Dr. Kayla's presentation all the way through, and really just an honor to be a part of this. So just as you mentioned, I have a personal journey like you do with my condition. I was diagnosed with idiopathic multicentric Castleman disease while I was a medical student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I hoped to become an oncologist to treat cancer patients. When I became a critically ill patient myself, I spent months hospitalized. I even had my last rites read to me, and eventually started getting chemotherapy that would save my life. But unfortunately, I would have a number of relapses and really ran out of options. There were no more drugs left. And that's when I went on this journey to create the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network to bring together physicians, researchers, and patients to advance research for Castleman disease, eventually identifying a drug that had never been used before for Castleman's that I began testing on myself. And thankfully, it's been over 7 years that I've been in remission on this treatment. And when I say testing the drug on myself, and I say I started this foundation, as you know all too well, it really was an incredible collaborative effort that the CDCN facilitated to bring together physicians, researchers, and patients to make these discoveries. But as you also know, it wasn't easy. There was a lot of knocking on biobank doors. There was a lot of trying to figure out solutions, working with the pharmaceutical industry to figure out what samples are maybe waiting to be unlocked from freezers. But it was through collaboration. It was through recognizing that the system really isn't positioned for collaboration. It's not positioned well for sharing of data and samples, and that we would need to do some radical things, following in your footsteps at Count Me In, going directly to patients to consent them to give us samples and also their medical records, to partner with the pharmaceutical industry. Actually, Janssen Pharmaceuticals has come up a number of times this afternoon. They made biospecimens available from their large randomized controlled trial in Castleman disease. They made it available to our research team, and we just published a week ago a novel predictive biomarker of response to their IL-6 blocker, and even a new therapeutic modality based on this proteomics data. These are samples that would have stayed in freezers and kind of frozen away that we were able to unlock. And so I think it's this sort of collaboration that really has enabled me to be here today and to be on this drug that's keeping me alive.
That's really incredible. Thank you for sharing all of that. Dr. Sharpless, it's clear to me and everybody who knows you that your commitment to data sharing is unparalleled. Dr. Feigenbaum and myself have both experienced firsthand the ability to accelerate discoveries through data generation as a result of a complete realignment of our incentives. I'd love to hear your view on the roles that the NCI can play in cementing the need to share data through changes in incentive structures.
Yeah, thank you, Corey. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. This is a topic I really care deeply about. And it's maybe the way I got to this is it just feels sort of frustrating, right? You as a physician, you take care of these patients. You think this guy with leukemia, that can't be that rare. Why can't I just find out what's happened to the other people like that? And then when you come to the NCI and you get interested in childhood cancer, that problem is essentially true for all of childhood cancers. Is why can't we just know what happened to the last 100 kids and have samples and share their data and we'll know. And many of you, I think, will remember Vice President Biden, when he was talking about the cancer moonshot, spoke explicitly on this topic at great length about how this was something that drove physicians, patients, advocates, loved ones, caregivers, everybody crazy, that there wasn't better data sharing, and we should just focus on that effort. And so when I came to the National Cancer Institute, I started asking these questions about how do we share data and what data do we hold. And to be fair, the National Cancer Institute has some very, very successful big data initiatives. The Cancer Genome Atlas would be the prototypical example, for example, which has been used widely for thousands of publications for purposes that nobody ever envisioned when they were starting out that effort. And it's been very, very successful. And I think it shows that when you make great data available to the research community, it will be used for really great purposes. But one thing I learned along the way is that this is much harder than I thought it was. David touched on the issues like just figuring out the inventories is not simple. People have stuff stuffed in their freezers. Nobody even knows what's in that box until they open it up, right? but there's also these issues of privacy and consent. A sample that may be acquired through a consent that was, intended for one purpose, and now we want to reuse it for whole genome sequencing, years later. And how does that work? Did the patient really agree to that? And then how do you distribute that data if it was obtained through no consent or through some other very limited consent? So these privacy and consent issues are a problem. And then I think also one thing that isn't really well appreciated is a lot of the quality of the data is not very good. Is that even if we have the data and we sort of know something about it, and then we want to put it somewhere and aggregate it in a way that's de-identified and protected, it's not easy to do that because often the data are like somebody's Excel spreadsheet with field names they made up, and it's just data aggregation. Somebody's got to go through that by hand and manually curate those data. So it's a much more expensive and complex endeavor than I think I realized until I tried to make it happen. So those are the challenges. I think they're well aware of this. This group is well aware of these challenges. What can we do about it? And that's what I think we should talk about today. But I will say one of the things we're very excited about the National Cancer Institute is the Childhood Data Initiative, which is really, I don't think we've ever had anything that's $50 million a year times 10 years, $500 million. That's really so focused on this issue because, as I said, this problem is just throughout childhood cancer research, and having great data and making it available, we think would be very, very useful with proper clinical annotation and genomic linkage, et cetera.
Thank you. You highlight a lot of the different barriers that we have to come together to solve. Dr. Feigenbaum, maybe you could expand from what Dr. Sharpless just said and describe what roles you think advocates and patients may play in terms of figuring out what data even exists so that we can find out how to benchmark gold standards and aggregate and surface what needs to be shared in the first place.
Yeah, I think patient advocates really are uniquely positioned to serve as this sort of quarterback within the medical system. Of course, researchers are constrained in the work that they do. Physicians obviously are constrained. The federal government, there are all these constraints. What academic institutions can do, there are kind of almost these lanes, right, that many of us are going down. And I think patient advocates have the ability to kind of cross between lanes and to basically say, to serve as an intermediate between a pharmaceutical company that may have some data or some samples or some insights and a researcher who maybe, like Dr. Sharpless mentioned, may just have a spreadsheet on his or her computer, and to be able to be that sort of unbiased driver who is at the end of the day so motivated for progress. I mean, you and I, Corey, we've connected over the years, and just the fact that our skin is in the game, and frankly, we have a lot of friends, of course, who have skin in the game with our particular diseases, and that will put us in a position where we're an unbiased advocate, but we also are relentless, right? And so, when we become aware that there's something in one place or another, and the speakers before us were so wonderful at highlighting the solutions to some of these big problems. I think that the solutions exist, as has been mentioned, and maybe they've even been around for a while, but they're not easy. They're expensive, they're hard. And I think that the patient advocate and patient advocacy groups are really well positioned to be that sort of dogged, bulldozer in the fight, to just kind of keep pushing, but recognizing that it's not going to always be easy. And just as Dr. Sharpless said, you may do all of the work, and at the end of the day, you get data that doesn't generate any insights that you can't do anything with. But I think that many of us have really great experiences where we've fought hard to get the data, get the samples, and we have gained something from it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Sharpless, building from that, I'd love your perspective on what we could do if we had more broad consent, if more patients were able to participate in research, and we could then put that knowledge into the hands of advocates to really drive awareness so that more people could participate in research. What are the barriers that you see right now with respect to patients' consent, whether it's the form of the consent or getting it into the hands of the right patients?
Well, I have several things to say on that topic. Maybe the first one to say is that consent is nice. It's good. We all like consent, but you have to be able to do research in the absence of consent, because there are some people who, for a variety of reasons, are not consented for clinical trials. They're not consented for sample collection. They're anonymous to our clinical trials infrastructure. And so we have to learn about what happens to these individuals in the real world. So the requirement for consent and the requirement for participation in a clinical trial is in a way not as inclusive as I think we would like our research efforts to be. So we have to solve that problem. And that is a conversation I think we as a society have to have. I mean, this is, I don't think the NCI director should say where our line should be on where we can waive consent, but IRBs and advocates and patients who care about cancer progress have to realize there's a fundamental tension between privacy and research. And privacy is good, research is good, and somewhere as a society we have to draw a line on where we are going to, what sort of research we are going to allow in the absence of consent. But I think we have to be able to do that, or we won't be able to make progress for all of our patients, as opposed to just the ones that want to participate on clinical trials. Then, when a patient is able to give consent, that's a better problem. Although you're not out of the woods yet, because consents are often, particularly in a prior era of research, were quite limited. They were sort of, you'll be on this lung cancer trial, and we'll give you this drug, and you consent to that trial for that. And then somebody that later on has samples and they want to, sequence their whole germline genome and put that on the internet. Did you consent for that? So we have to really look at consent and understand what we've asked individuals to do, and is that okay? And would a reasonable individual have agreed to this analysis? Mm-hmm. And many people, then when I explain this problem, say, well, why don't you just call them back up and reconsent them? Sounds like a great idea. It doesn't work nearly as well as one might imagine. It's very difficult. Often we can't track people down. It's expensive. People don't generally like to get phone calls when they've been cured of cancer years ago saying, by the way, can we, sequence your tumor? So it's not always a well-received conversation, suffice it to say. So, consent is really important, and I think makes a lot of this simpler, but it doesn't solve all the problems, because, this research is sensitive. When you talk about intrinsically identifying information, things like, elaborate electronic health records, as well as genomic information that is private and unique to an individual. Doing research with that has some risk to the individual, and in terms of compromising their anonymity. I think the NCI has gotten really good at thinking through these issues. We have privacy protecting technologies, hashing and matching, and synthetic data and stuff like that. We have data enclaves where we create super secure data structures where one can only get in and compute on the data in the cloud, for example, and not download the data. So we have measures to address these things. Mm-hmm. And I think I believe that we can provide the opportunity to do great research that really addresses the questions we need to address, while simultaneously protecting the individuals who are participating in science. But this is where we need advocacy to weigh in, because there are some judgment calls where we need society to understand what we're doing and what we intend to do.
Thank you for sharing that. I'd love your perspective, Dr. Feigenbaum, on whether or not you ran into any of those issues with consent, and if your life would have been made easier if you were able to conduct any type of research in ways that would have been made, I don't want to say without consent necessarily, but that were not constrained by the current consents of the samples that you were trying to get your hands on.
Yeah, it's a great question. And at the beginning, I alluded to this particular study where we utilized nearly 100 samples from patients that were part of a clinical trial, samples that actually those patients consented for 10 years of research use. And we were closing in on that 10-year period. So literally they were going to have to be discarded. And that was an example where it wasn't that the patient said, I only want you to do research for 10 years. Just someone had written a consent that said, you can only do research for 10 years on it. So it wasn't necessarily the patients didn't want us to do it anymore, but that's just what they signed off on. And so we got our hands on them around year 8. We proteomically profiled the samples, and we learned a lot. We learned this predictive biomarker signature. We identified a new therapeutic target based on it. But I think it's a good example where we went through all these options. Can we recontact the patients like Dr. Sharpless mentioned? And we learned that many of those patients are no longer alive. In fact, I think half of those patients have died from their disease. So truly, this is their last true legacy on Earth, right? These are samples they gave. The drug may have helped them for some period of time, but now they have an opportunity, there's a legacy opportunity for their sample to help a future patient. And so we felt really, really compelled to do everything we could to do as much research as we could before that 10-year window ran out. And, one possibility Dr. Sharpless mentioned is that in some societies, you could go to ethics committees or IRBs and say, you know what, there's a 10-year limit here, but we're looking for an exemption here. And it's possible that that could have been given, but we decided to try to get as much work done in that 10-year window as possible. And then the remaining samples actually were discarded. And you know, for someone like me, that's really, really tough as a researcher and also a patient. The idea that these clinically annotated clinical trial samples, high grade samples, truly cannot be used, you know, beyond that period is really difficult. But as you know, we've really gone the route of saying, let's go directly to patients. Let's consent patients directly. In fact, earlier today, I was on the phone with a patient on the other side of the country who's sick in the hospital with Castleman disease, and we're able to consent that patient to our study. We can send tubes in the mail, overnight tubes to the family. The family will bring the tubes into the hospital. Blood will get drawn during clinical draw. These tubes will get added to it, send the tubes back to us. This bypasses the challenges of having to get an IRB set up at every institution in the country, or having to work with every academic center for transfer samples. And so these sort of direct to patient opportunities, at the end of the day, the patient wants to be a part of this. And this is a great way to work with them in avoiding some of the bureaucratic issues that we've seen.
Yeah, we've had very similar experiences with Count Me In. It's the will of the patient. Nobody wants us to succeed more. Nobody wants us to make discoveries faster. They're definitely the biggest stakeholders, and I think it's incumbent upon us to find creative ways, just like you did. And you know, I really hope that everybody in attendance is thinking, how could I drive this faster? You know, working directly with patients. What kind of protocol can I write that has, you know, if we are going to, you know, generate data, maximal capacity to share. And I think that we've, you know, hopefully surfaced a lot of issues that can transcend what we're doing here today and get into the right hands, advocates and patients, so that they even understand your tissue and your tumors and your data could be destroyed within a time frame. You know, maybe people, if they're aware of this, they will take action to preserve and drive the research that we need so desperately, so that we can generate the data to be shared for everybody like you. And unfortunately, we have a really quick session today and we are out of time. So I would very much like to thank you, Dr. Ned Sharpless and Dr. David Bakenbaum, and all of the attendees joining us today. Up next is the session, Patient Power, the untapped resource for accelerating discovery, being led by Sue Sherman from the Lamb Foundation. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much.
My name is Sue Sherman. I am the Executive Director and CEO of the Lamb Foundation. We are a rare disease patient advocacy organization based in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I will be joined shortly by my colleague and co-presenter, Andrea Slattery. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and participate in this extraordinary exchange. It's been riveting from the patient perspective and the patient advocacy perspective, and a special shout out to Corey and David for their passionate and eloquent fireside chat prior to this presentation. As Andrea and I were preparing for today and working to conclude this important discussion, we wanted to reflect with you about why all of this matters, but I think that came out very clearly throughout the afternoon about the power of patients for accelerating scientific and clinical discovery so that we might one day have a future without untreatable diseases. I have been struck all afternoon by how the conversation today is very much what we experience each and every day with our patients, clinicians, researchers, and all of the comments that we've talked about. It's actually been reaffirming to realize how much we have achieved, even despite our flawed system. And one cannot help but wonder, how much more can we get done and how much faster can we get it done if we actually solve these issues of data sharing? But very briefly, I'll give you some context and then we'll welcome Andrea. Lymphangioliomyomatosis, that's LAM. It is a rare lung disease that almost exclusively affects women in the prime of their lives. The average age of diagnosis is 35 years. This disease is characterized by an abnormal growth of smooth muscle cells that especially proliferate in the lung. It's extremely rare, 3 to 7 cases per million people. It's a progressive disease, and ultimately women will progress to needing oxygen or transplant potentially. Our mission, like that of most patient advocacy organizations, is all about the patient. We urgently seek safe and effective treatments and ultimately a cure for LAM. And we do this through advocacy and the funding of research. As with everything talked about today, it's about bringing together the scientific, medical, and patient communities by offering information, resources, and pushing things forward. So this slide lists the accomplishments of the foundation, but I would argue that this is actually the accomplishments of the LAM patient community. This has taken 25 years, actually 26, and this is what can happen when patients organize and put their best interests first. Even again, in this flawed world that was presented this afternoon, this is what in 25 years has been achieved. We have an FDA-approved treatment for LAM, approved in 2015, called sirolimus. It is now approved in 20 countries globally. We have published treatment guidelines. We have a blood-based biomarker that reduces the need for surgical biopsy. We have a database of more than 3,000 patients at our US Foundation, and we have 19 sister organizations around the world with another 6,500 patients identified. We have assembled a global network of LAM clinical centers and research centers, and they are a place where patients can go to get informed care, which is not easy with rare disease communities. We have raised nearly $29 million, 90% of that from patients and families. 17 million of that has been dedicated to research, and we estimate that that small investment relatively has been leveraged to another $50 million worth of research into this small disease. We have made additional investments in education, patient support, and awareness activities. And we've been recognized as a model to emulate by the New England Journal of Medicine and the NIH. So again, it's extraordinary that when patients are, how motivated patients are to change their own futures. So one asks, how does a group get this done? And I made this slide, which is a list of the clinical trials over the last 20 years dedicated to LAM research. One might also argue that it's an exercise in acronyms, but it's a long list for, again, an organization where there was really no research just 26 years ago. And the asterisks show where the LAM patients have helped fund research through the LAM Foundation. And the points I wanted to make here were really reflected almost all afternoon, is that while we have made remarkable progress and data from these trials is available in some cases, not always accessible, for the most part, samples and data live in silos. And we would like to propose that if all of this data were available, how much faster progress might have been made and how many more discoveries and the what ifs of preserving life, of preserving families, and improved function and wellness if we were able to get to these answers faster. And then moving from this success, if we think about looking ahead and the power that patients could bring to this entire equation, the commitment from our patients would be yes to consent. It's come up today, streamlined consent. They're willing, they want to share their data, as David mentioned in our last talk. They're energized to reduce the complexity. When we think about the quality of this data and what's possible with new technologies, patient-reported outcomes, quality of life measures, and input to trial design from the patient perspective is something that we think about all the time. And how this can be integrated into clinical data and result in new questions to be asked from the patient perspective, and really have a better assessment of the individual experience with this disease. We know that the technology is out there to enhance the data. Recently, with the pandemic, the power of telemedicine has only amplified. And what we're seeing now is that we're able to use home-based data metrics and remote access to power clinical trials. And this could mean breaking down borders. This could mean more diversity and inclusion. And as for example, we have an ongoing clinical trial right now where since the time of the pandemic, we've been able to enroll patients from overseas who supplied all of their data electronically through home spirometry. And finally, the last bullet here is really to echo that the technology exists in the time of social media, in the time of digital journaling, and the ways that patients want to actively engage with researchers, with clinical trials, that the ease of entering data through apps, the possibility of this data integration for patient-reported outcomes and clinical or quality measures and clinical metrics is really we think it can be unleashed. So I think that patients are ready to continue their part and are looking to this group of people to bring it together and move things forward much faster. It is now my pleasure to welcome to this presentation my colleague and friend and my inspiration. Andrea Slattery and I have known each other for 8 years, and in that time, she has taught me that no is a word that others may choose to use. But when it comes to advocating for patients with LAM, when it comes to raising money or reaching out for the next accomplishment, the word no is just somebody else's opinion. Andrea is a partner at Symmetry Peak Management, a technology investment firm. She is a CFA charter holder, one of the most respected designations in the field of investment analysis. She is a wife, a mother, and a philanthropist. Importantly for today, she has LAM and has a perspective that reframes everything we've heard today. So please welcome Andrea Slattery.
Thank you, Sue. And thank you to everyone here for inviting me to share my patient experience here with you today. It has been a fascinating discussion, and I can tell you from a patient perspective, extremely encouraging. I was diagnosed 14 years ago when I was 4 months pregnant. I had a busy, successful career. I was newly married, and I had plans for starting and growing my family. So literally everything was ahead of me. But the world as I knew it completely changed with one word: lymphangioliomyomatosis. At that moment of diagnosis, oftentimes a patient is willing to do anything and everything that will help research progress. I joined the board of the LAM Foundation, and shortly thereafter, I was elected board chair. I believed so much in the LAM Foundation because of the strong collaboration between scientists, clinicians, and patients, but also because of their willingness to share data and collaborate between the NIH, LAM scientists, patients, and clinical research centers. This collaboration resulted in the LAM Foundation finding an FDA-approved treatment for LAM, something only 5% of rare diseases have accomplished. These are just some of the things that I was willing to do to make sure that I provided the best possible future for my family. But the pace of progress confounded me. As someone who works in the technology industry, I have an intimate appreciation for the exponential growth of systems, processing speeds, data generation, and knowledge aggregation. Yet, in a speech by Chris Austin, then director of the National Center for Accelerating Translational Sciences, also known as NCATS at the NIH, he said that at our current pace, if we do nothing differently, it will take 2,000 years to find treatments for all rare diseases. 2,000 years. In the life of someone with LAM, each day we lose lung function at a rate of 3 to 4 times someone without LAM. Every few months, we adjust to a new normal of less energy, more breathlessness, and shortened exercise routines. And each year, families must forego or choose between the joy of having children with the prospect of leaving them potentially motherless. In fact, just this month, a 29-year-old LAM patient and mother-to-be delivered her daughter at 28 weeks, but lost her life in the process, leaving a husband, daughter, and loved ones devastated. In this example, which is illustrative of far too many patients, the cost of time literally equals life lost and impossible choices. You heard from Sue how we as patients are doing our part. I'm willing to consent and have my data shared. In fact, I want to do more. Streamlined apps for data entry, integration of clinical records, creation of a personal health dashboard. These types of tools, which are hardly revolutionary, would empower patients to make data sharing even more compelling. When you have a disease, you need research to move as quickly as possible because it has real life implications for life choices and many times life expectancy. And I get it, this is hard. As we've heard today, there are so many complexities between academia, government, corporations with respect to patient privacy and data. And all of these regulations exist for good reason, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And we can't let what's difficult prevent us from finding an enabling solution. Possibly with the advancements in technology, it may be possible to both comply with regulations and also share data in ways that simply weren't possible just 10 to 15 years ago. We must commit to sharing this data to accelerate progress. Put simply, collaboration equals better results. Patients need the FDA, the NIH, and data companies to share the data to accelerate research progress. Because by working together and pushing down the barriers to share data, we can save lives. Thank you so much for having me here today. And Sue, now I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Appreciate your comments. And with this, I'd like to also thank all of our attendees and who joined us throughout the day today. We're going to turn it over now to a message from Holly Smith at the DataSphere Project.
Thank you, Sue. It's such an honor to have you and Andrea close out today's session. You really hit home why we're all here at the end of the day. On behalf of CEO Roundtable on Cancer and Project DataSphere, I'd like to thank all of our speakers and participants in today's events, especially our partners at the FDA. A special thanks goes out to everyone involved in our planning committee. I hope we can collectively keep this high level of energy and engagement around the topic of data sharing and reuse, that we stay committed to making this new future of clinical trial data sharing a reality. Thanks so much.